I heard that certainly appreciated very much the first, second panels that I had an opportunity to see, and unfortunately had to leave for another conference for the third panel. So really appreciated the panelists and Bill for taking it through. Bill, do you want to start off with a wrap up in terms of what happened yesterday? Our lead into day two. I think hopefully most of you were there and were able to really be able to take part and appreciate kind of where we've come from, how we've gotten to this point, what are some of the innovations that are leading us into this next stage of the rare disease drug strategy. And hopefully we all can appreciate how timely this is, because there are so many things that are coming through that are going to transform the lives of rare disease patients, but we just need to be able to get them available to our patients. So, Bill, I'm going to punt it over to you, if you don't mind, for a little recap from day one.
Yeah, not at all. And in fact, I'd actually encourage everyone on the line to contribute to this in terms of, their insights or thoughts or what really struck them from day one, to complement some of the wrap up that I can go through too, because this is really there are many people who are on the line today who were our panelists yesterday. All of the delegates had time to reflect on what was said, and I'm sure you had some great insights that you had offline. So please feel free to contribute and continue to contribute to the chat panel, because that was just awesome yesterday. Let's keep it up. So yesterday I had a great kickoff where Durhan, you walked through what's happening at the United Nations and at the global level. And in fact, to really start today, I'm going to turn it back to you to tell us about what is happening even live right now in other countries, which is so exciting, to continue that conversation. Platform one, in terms of expediting timely and optimal access to diagnosis and care, we actually heard that so much is happening in the research and clinical levels across the country, from Winnipeg to British Columbia to down east. That discussion in terms of clinical centers of excellence, research and primary care and access to care for patients also revealed a couple of gaps, including the disparity in newborn screening, access to newborn screening, the great news for some folks with SMA, though, who did have access to really early and quick diagnosis, who are having terrific results. And I know we heard one kid with SMA in the background, and I think it was Lindsay who said, "I'm sorry, there's about the background." And I just love seeing that in the chat panel. No, hearing a happy burbling boy with SMA in the background is the kind of sounds and background sounds we want to hear at CORD, at these kinds of conferences. So thank her and thank everyone, because that's a sign and a sound of success. It also, though, highlighted some gaps. And when we got into the second, well, I want to just quickly go through the case study. Amazing work by Doug Earle to talk about some of the issues around blindness and gene therapy for maintaining vision. Again, catching that early, and we know we have treatments, but those treatments are actually stuck at a certain stage in the review process. And just thank you, Doug, and the team from that brought forward that case study yesterday, for encouraging people to go to that very simple website. It's interesting when we talk about individual issues, it actually highlights that entire roadmap for so many of these medicines to actually get to clinic and get to patients. So have a look at that website, and we can put it back in the chat panel again, because Doug, it's your issue today in terms of blindness, but that's a path that many who contributed yesterday have already been on. In fact, it was great to see so much on the cystic fibrosis front yesterday. Kim Steele and others were there to say, yes, this is what happened with us. This is how we have established our registries. We heard a lot about patient registries yesterday, who should fund them, how they should be run. And I think there's a lot we can pull from that and take forward to help contribute to the plan. The third session was actually platform 2, and a special thanks again to Eileen McMahon from Tories for really setting it up well with 3 general themes and issues. One was intellectual property, a definition for orphan drugs and rare diseases at the global level. It seems like Canada is decades behind on providing a signal to developers that you deal with who ask you, should and when should I come to Canada with these new therapies? And you're giving them back the signal that we don't have a separate data protection stream or opportunity for medicines for rare disorders. So that was one thing, a signal that's not there. The second theme that you brought up was a signal that is actually more of a red light, which is the PMPRB. And we spent a lot of time in platform 2 talking about how and why the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board changes are that cloud of uncertainty to make it very hard to justify bringing new products to Canada. And we heard actually from some clinician researchers saying that there are issues in terms of getting access to the clinical trials in advance of what we would normally expect in Canada. And that's where rare disease patients depend so much on access, early access to these medicines. And there's some issues there in terms of even access to the research level, let alone commercialization. And then the third theme that Eileen, you brought forward and that was discussed was just the access pathway, clunky, untransparent, and sometimes blocking. And that was through the health technology assessment process into the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, and finally funded access through the public systems. Now, today, maybe I'll turn it over to you, Durhan, to talk about Platform 3 and how, yes, we've identified the roadmap, some of the road, a lot of the obstacles, but I think this is the opportunity to start realizing the vision and look forward and be positive. So maybe I'll turn it back to you to introduce what we're going to do today.
Thank you very much, Bill. That was such a succinct and very, very optimistic, to be honest, summary to even though day one, we still have a lot of obstacles there. So that was wonderful. Yeah, day 2 is going forward. And we really decided that we wanted to hit right off the bat the big issue of how do we want to create this innovative platform, but we really want to look at what are we going to do with the financing? We're holding the government accountable. It's $500 million a year, $1 billion to set it up in that first 2 years. And the question we really want to say is, how do we, as accountable stakeholders, patients, healthcare professionals, researchers, including the pharmaceuticals, going to contribute to making sure that that money is used as widely as possible while holding accountable the providers, meaning not only the regulators, but also the payers, both public and private, to putting the patients first. So we're going to be accountable financially as much as possible. We are going to hold the financiers accountable for making sure that the patients get access to the best. Because at the end of the day, that is going to be the best solution, as we've heard over and over again. When patients get the right medicine, it's done accountably, it's done with follow-up. That at the end of the day is not only best outcomes, it is the best use of the money. Bingo, we have a winning solution. So we need to figure out how to get there and to make sure everybody's on that same page. I was pleased in the part of what I was listening to all again. I think Dr. Greenberg talked about it. And as did Dr. McMillan, we need those public-private partnerships. And I know Frederick talked about it from Pfizer, but we need those public-private partnerships. That's what's succeeding. So we're going to talk a bit about that today in that first session. And I'm really delighted just this preview to have that Rosalie Wyant from CD Howe is going to kick us off to give us some hopefully not only pathways, but really help us understand some of those challenges along that very challenging pathway. So this is our first panel. And then our second panel, we're really going to talk about then, okay, the core of what we want, our number one ask, because we believe, again, it is the most effective way of ensuring we have the right health system that's going to meet everybody's needs. And that is how patients are fully engaged. That for us, is the key to it. And, I think around the world, in every system that we're talking about, that is no longer just a mantra. That's no longer just a rallying cry. That's no longer just a vision in the patient's eyes or those who want to be able to say, yeah, we're doing the right thing. What we've realized that is the right thing. It is not only the best pathway to get us to where we need to be in terms of the most efficient use in terms of our health resources. It is the only way. So we're delighted we're seeing patient engagement no longer becoming just a good thing that we ought to have because it's the right thing to do, but it is in fact the endorsed pathway. So how do we make sure that happens in this strategy moving forward? And we've got a whole host of the right people that are going to help us do that. And maybe kicking that off, though, we're going to hear maybe where are some of the kinks still and what do we need to do to address that? So hemophilia, which has been our poster child for so many years in terms of being able to make that kind of progress, is going to give us some real highlights in terms of what's working and what's not working. So that's a little bit of a map going forward. And I think, Bill, I don't know if you have a couple of other announcements before we really turn it over to our panelists.
I just, Durhan, before we got on the line, you were saying that a signal from another part of the world is so exciting that is, maybe share that, because I think that that's a great way to, shine the light to where Canada could go.
Let me set the stage. Bill was talking about crying babies. Just before you guys came on, we actually had a crying baby in the background here. Because full disclosure, I am in Africa, in Ghana. We're at the first ever Africa Continent Rare Disease Summit. And it is so very exciting. The only disappointment is our South African delegates couldn't come because of the new Omicron variant. But they did participate through the internet. We had some amazing presentations. Rudiger Krecht, who is the WHO representative in terms of public health and region issues, was on to tell us very much so with the UN resolution that we talked about yesterday, with the WHO commitment to universal health coverage, that from their perspective, rare diseases needs and will be getting the same kind of treatment as other chronic diseases. And the WHO is not only fully committed to helping advance rare diseases, but he said directly, we see rare diseases is helping us provide some of the solutions for our chronic disease. And he cited what we have been saying all along, probably a lot less authority, that many of the advances we're making in understanding and in developing the vaccines and treatments for COVID-19 have come from the research that's been done with rare diseases. So we are really going to be able to, I think, count on that kind of a support. And we will have that resolution, I think, to help us on the other sectors of it. I will make one other statement, and then, Bill, thanks for the opportunity while I'm on Ghana. Yesterday, in the dinner to kick off the summit, the Minister for Public Health from Ghana was here. And he came for the dinner, a little bit of a glad handing. He was so impressed with the people, with the delegations from across Africa, with the role that Ghana certainly could play in terms of advancing rare diseases across Africa. He made the commitment to stay for the entire day today, not just make a opening speech. And in the context of his thought, he said something that I think probably surprised everybody. Hopefully he didn't surprise his government. And that is that Ghana is fully committed in all 5 pillars of their, universal health coverage, that patients living with rare diseases will get absolutely the same level, the same equitable treatment as all other patients. They will work toward that. So we were truly impressed, as I also was with the regulatory agency that came forth. They have created special pathways for rapid access in terms of approval for orphan drugs in Ghana. This was done because of the Rare Disease Initiative. They demonstrated to them that if you're treating patients with rare diseases with therapies that are available, it's going to keep them out of the emergency room. It's going to be cost effective, and go ahead of the Rare Disease Ghana Rare Disease Initiative did that study and convinced everybody we need to be doing that. So hey, you guys. If Ghana can do this, so can we. But I also had an opportunity to brag about Canada, and people are truly amazed in terms of the kind of leadership that Canada is also playing, especially with this rare disease drug strategy. So I think we all really feel that the future, they're very optimistic, and that there are reasons to believe that that global movement is going to carry everybody forward. So yeah, thanks, Bill, for that opportunity.
Excellent. Well, that's terrific. And honestly, the chat panel is lighting up with their thoughts on yesterday. And then that was a great shout out from from Africa, and you know, yeah, let's get back to it and continue to build the plan, which is what day 2 is about. Let's realize the vision. Platform 3, we're going to follow a similar format as we did yesterday for the next 2 platforms, and that involves an opening presentation or Kickstarter from an expert. In this case, Rosalie Wyonch, from the Senior Policy Analyst at the C.D. Howe Institute in Toronto, and it's great to see you, Rosalie. Rosalie is going to kick off this panel, which is then going to open up to a number of other experts. We've actually got over an hour for this panel, which is terrific, and encourage folks on the line and delegates from yesterday to put your hand up, get in the chat panel and get involved. But the other people who we've invited to take part in this include Chris McMaster, Scientific Director at the Canadian Institutes of Health Research Institute of Genetics, and he's also a prof at DAL and CEO at DenovaMed Inc. We've got Lori Lambert, lead of real world evidence at CADIT. It's great to see you, Lori. Thanks for joining us. We've got Suzanne McMullen, principal at Medlior Health Outcomes Research, with experience on how to actually make RWE work in the go forward, not just at one time when we review something at CADIT or through HTA. We've got some really neat stuff coming out of an organization called Pentavere or Pentavere, if we're pronouncing it but you can correct me there. Chris Pettingell, who's Chief Medical Officer at Pentavere, is going to tell us how some incredible stuff is coming out of Canada in terms of artificial intelligence to actually make sense of all kinds of real world evidence that just a few years ago would have been indecipherable noise. Sorry to, maybe I'm setting you up too much, Chris, here, but that's what okay, good. We've got Christina Cunningham, Director of Public Affairs, Canada at Vertex Pharmaceuticals in Toronto. Thanks, great to see you, Christina. And we've got Bob McClay. I don't see Bob yet, but he might turn his video on. No, Durhan's shaking his head.
No, he couldn't make it. Yeah. No.
Okay.
Yeah. We have a cast of thousands anyway.
Let's get at it. Rosalie, over to you to kick us off. Tell us about how to create innovative financing pathways for efficient, effective, and cost-effective drug access, or at least start us on the path. Over to you.
I was going to say, if I had the full answer to that question, I think we might be a little bit further ahead, but really thanks Bill and Durhan for that setup. And really, I just wanted to take us through really just sort of some of the discussion points and things that have been recommended, as well as reflections on the current health policy landscape and maybe some ways to move forward. So just to start off, really looking at the sort of points that have been laid out in terms of the ways forward, establish a national agency to develop multiple financing pathways specific to the needs of the patient population. Yes. Leverage managed access programs to provide timely access. Absolutely. Facilitate concurrent Health Canada and health technology assessments to speed up the review and really reimbursement process. Yes, let's do that. Implement real world data collection and utilization of real world evidence throughout the drug cycle. Again, yes, these are all good ideas and they are all things that we should do. And really, I just sort of, not to drown the optimism from where I'm starting, but just really think that the there's a lot of moving parts to the healthcare system right now. It's been under emergency response for almost 2 years now, and there are quite a lot of problems that have been illuminated by COVID. And we actually, just one thing that I noticed disappeared, it was there in the election cycle, but wasn't in the throne speech, was really discussion of pharmacare in general. And so it's just one of those things that is, with everything in healthcare being disrupted, I think there is a need to really keep it top of the agenda. And really, Durhan, what you were mentioning in terms of the WHO and the movements there, I think is actually a good signal that is doable. Keeping it on the front of mind is very much a possibility. And I would also say that COVID-19 and the experience with vaccines has really changed the narrative around what innovative pharma means in Canada, at least to the public and in the political space. Previous to the pandemic, it really was all about prices. I could get into whether or not that was the right talking point to get stuck on, but really, I think the narrative has shifted in that what matters to Canadians generally, not just the ones that know about the system and are really trying to get access, the ones that just everyday Canadians are now much more aware of the interaction between prices, access, and what that can mean for them and their health. And so I think that this is maybe the issues that are closer to home for the rare disease community are now maybe everybody else is a little more aware of them, and there might be some allies to find there. And so those are just a couple of reflections on where we're at. Really the main challenge coming out of the pandemic is that with all of the things that have been illuminated by COVID, we do have the challenge of the tyranny of the urgent, with mental health care, seniors care, all being really top of mind items. There is a lot of noise in the healthcare space. And I would say that the current impasse between government and pharma companies, and just say the lingering specter of PMPRB regulations, will they, won't they? It's been going on for years, and we really need to either, something needs to be done, but the current situation of uncertainty, maybe yes, maybe no, is in my opinion, potentially worse than not having any certainty about what the future will be. I think that there's been a lot of opportunity costs in terms of companies just not being optimistic about the future of the market in Canada. And so that really does affect our access. And so I think that we really do need to think about, from both sides, new ways to get past this impasse and maybe stop talking about specific prices for specific drugs, and instead start turning more towards these value-based frameworks. And I just wanted to give a little bit of background information about some of the value-based healthcare initiatives that have at least been piloted in Canada, and so might be something to build on, and just different ways of looking at them. So the first one I'd want to talk about would be social impact bonds. And that's where a nonprofit service provider seeks private investment to finance a social program. The government will agree to repay investors with interest if the program meets targeted outcomes. So that's one way to leverage private dollars into the system for the goal of generating social impact. And that's, I think, a way to move forward technologies that patients and manufacturers, providers, developers all think could have great benefit. But if the government, say the will for moving those issues forward isn't there on the political side, that there needs to be a way to leverage the private market and get the government involved when it needs to get involved, and really keep that focus on outcomes and improving outcomes for patients. Another example would be outcome-linked funding, where the amount that a service provider receives depends on the extent to which outcomes are measurable and achieved. And so for that, we actually do need better real-world monitoring. But that's another way to potentially share risk between companies that stand to profit as well as the government, in terms of making good use of limited taxpayer dollars for the optimal patient outcomes. Accountable care, incentive payments reward healthcare providers that deliver high quality care using a variety of processes and patient experience. Again, we would need better real world monitoring. bundled funding and outcome-linked procurement. Payments for specific procedures are integrated, and so we pay for a whole care pathway, way to get interdisciplinary care all under one package, and not say get bogged down in the details of what money is paid for the drug versus what money is paid to the provider, which is versus rehab. It's just, if this is the price and it can be done, you know, that's one way to sort of, I guess, build a little flexibility in terms of how we look at funding and structuring in the system. And I guess one of the last ones that's pretty open-ended, but there is some opportunity for, is just simply open innovation challenges, where the government lays out a problem and doesn't say necessarily how they want it solved. They just request proposals for, do you have an idea? Do you think you could solve it? And then really funds based on the objective as opposed to the process. And so those are just some of the examples of value-based healthcare in Canada. And I'd be happy to sort of follow up with anybody about specific examples where things have worked or haven't worked in Canada. But one of the main issues with sort of those initiatives in Canada is that they tend to stay pilots. And so though that can get access for patients in a particular jurisdiction or for a particular time period, we have trouble scaling up value-based initiatives that could really, you know, direct funds towards specific solvable problems, make more efficient use of dollars. And really what's the most important there is that by making the efficient use of the dollars that we have, there's not so much savings in the healthcare system. That's more just resources that are freed up to allow for more innovation, allow for broader coverage, or potentially paying for new treatments as they're developed. And so just, you know, thinking at, those are some of the examples at the micro level, but then really just thinking sort of more, switching to the more government and macro level, there are policies that could be implemented that could really change how we think about the technology assessment process, and how we really think about how we pay for drugs. Really similar to the way that we look at physicians and how we pay them. Looking at the incentives in the system and ways to share and manage risk is really what will break up the impasse, is how can we find a functional way of funding the thing that works for everybody. And so just wanted to spend a few minutes on budget impact and managed entry agreements. And again, what we really depend on is real world effectiveness. And there's a certain market size uncertainty in a lot of cases. And so the way that budget impact and managed entry agreements work is that initial prices can be adjusted as more evidence becomes available. So an initial launch price is negotiated based either on what the expected effectiveness is or how many patients they think the market will be. And then prices for treatments are adjusted as more evidence becomes available. A case study of these agreements in 4 countries, Belgium, the UK, the Netherlands, and Sweden, found over 100 of these contracts, and their forms varied quite a lot. Some of the price adjustments are conditional on total expenditure. So the government sets a global budget for what they're willing to pay for a certain treatment. Others provide systemic collection of patient outcome data after market launch, or monitor the restrictions on patient categories for which the drug could be prescribed. And some agreements are actually described as having payment by result, where the drug price paid depends on observed patient outcomes after the fact. And so, you know, got a lot more to say than I can cover in the 5 or 10 minutes that we've got here. But that's just, you know, sort of from the economics perspective and the current landscape, some of the funding mechanisms that have been tried out in Canada. as well as some that I think, particularly managed entry agreement and budget impact assessment, is really something that we could do to lower the frictions between, say, when a drug is in clinical to when it might be fully reimbursable and accessible at a hospital. There needs to be something to bridge the gap between those two stages. And I think that managed entry agreements could be a way to do so, getting patients access, but also minimizing the risk to government budgets and, you know, the overall fiscal picture, and ensuring that we are actually getting good value for money, and really paying for the treatments that do work and benefit patients, and not say just trying anything and everything at whatever price. There does need to be some logic to the system, and I think breaking through the impasse does take a certain amount of thinking through the financial complexities of how we could structure this to share risk. And I, don't want to take any time from my other esteemed panelists, so I will just end it there and look forward to your questions.
Wow, that was powerful. We probably could have done the whole 3 hours with you, though I think many other people would have probably turned out by now. But I am so pumped up by what you're saying in terms of the options and the opportunities. And I do think Frederick raised it, what about people that are laggards? What about those who are not ready? And I think what you said before is so important. We're not talking pilots, but we do need to have what I keep calling learning. Let's set up some discrete projects, discrete drugs, put in place what we think might be the best model, and you've given us a plethora to possibly choose from for that specific instance. I mean, we heard yesterday from Luxturna. It would have been a slightly different model for Zolgensma. It would be slightly different from what David's going to talk about in hemophilia, but there are right models that are maybe the best choices. Learn from them. Don't be wedded to them. Recognize that we're going to learn some things. We're going to take some risks. And we're also going to fund putting in some of those systems that you're talking about to actually make it work. And I think that's the case. I mean, what the hell is $1 billion for anyway, if it isn't to take some risk with it and see what we get back out of it. So this is the big opportunity. I'm hoping that one of the webinars we will do next year, in leading up to the April, what I keep calling the April launch, you guys, we're going to keep talking about it until it's real, that we will be focusing though much more broadly on some of these financial models. So I think this is a really amazing cornucopia that you've offered to us. So it'll be up to us to, I think, bring together some of the right minds to make it happen. And speaking of right minds, I'm really happy to kind of move this over to 4 colleagues who I think are going to be somewhat speaking, a little bit back to back, but I think hopefully together around some of the issues that you raised, because managed access or outcomes-based, value-based agreements are exactly what we're all looking forward to in terms of the ability to certainly take some risk, provide drugs with uncertainty, and have lots of promise, but may not actually have all of the information for all the populations from whom it may benefit, or all the outcomes at the time it's launched. So, I think, a good number of years ago, the idea of even managed access schemes were just impossible to think of. I think the latest report that came out of OECD really showed that the majority of managed access schemes up to now have really just cost control measures. They've been just, ways in which we can limit the risk taking in, ceilings in terms of prices that can be paid by putting in agreements that basically maxed out. I'm going to turn off my video. I'm getting a little bit of an unstable signal here. And I really want to be able to stay into this as long as possible. But rest assured that if I disappear, Bill is going to put on my wig and kind of seamlessly step in place. So he's all prepared. No, seriously, we're going to co-host this. So I'm really delighted. But I do think that even in the last few years, we've made such advances in terms of understanding and collecting and analyzing real-world evidence. I think you're going to hear from Christopher, who's going to, really, we're going to give him a whole webinar, because they will knock your socks off in terms of what's being able to be done in terms of mining electronic, medical records, to really look at what are the patterns you use, what are the outcomes beyond just ticking off, how much did each insurer pay for what kind of a reimbursement, that is by way of the dodo now in terms of really being able to demonstrate any kind of value-based outcome. So we're getting the technology. we're getting the, the financial, I think, analytic tools that are going to allow us to really take real advantage of this. So I hate to say it, but I think the nerds are going to really be running our healthcare system and our drug reimbursement system from the beginning. So, so Rosalie and, Laurie and Christopher and both Chris's, quite frankly, I'm really going to kind of turn it over to you, and maybe we'll just start with maybe Chris. I'll start with you and Lori, and you can speak certainly from the real world evidence form that we did already some of that already, but maybe where you see. And maybe picking up on what Rosalie talked about in terms of the role of real world evidence in terms of managed access scheme. How do we get it up to stuff? How do we really get to the point where we can use that real world evidence to really be able to demonstrate and be able to set up, truly functional value-based agreements?
I can start if you like, Bill, or Chris McMaster. Do you want to start? Well, Chris and I and Durhane actually were all, and Frederick were involved in organizing a Best Brains exchange that we had recently, and that was to really kick off, really starting to move and take action, as people are saying, rather than just talking about real world evidence for drugs for rare disease. And it was nice to hear Rosalie talk, because very much on the same page of all the things that came up in that meeting. And I just want to ensure everyone that, Cadith and me for real world evidence, we really are working very hard right now to actually put things into action. So we're meeting with Health Canada, we're meeting with CORD and all the patient organizations. We're going to be meeting with IMC Biotech very soon. So we had 10 different types of stakeholders at the Best Brains Exchange. We had over 150 people there. And now we're meeting with each type of stakeholder to say, okay, how do we move forward? What are the challenges? What do you need to make this happen? We're meeting with all registries next week. And I just really believe myself, I've been doing HTA and specifically focusing on real world evidence since 2004. So I'm getting older and hopefully wiser. And I'm actually feeling quite confident of talking to registry holders that I think that I get it from my own experiences. I'm hearing similar experiences. So I can say I really find the way forward. And I would argue that a lot of what Rosalie talked about, real world evidence can fill a gap, because real world evidence provides information. If we can have information that people trust and believe in, and that's all stakeholders, that the patients believe it, the patients believe it, the payers believe it, that the HTA assessment deliberators believe it, or at least know what information is needed, that's when things are actually going to start happening. And Canada, we're smart. I think Chris will say we have good researchers, we have the science. It's just bringing people together, a bit like Frederick said, to make it happen. And we're seeing lots of opportunities to make that happen in learning projects right now. So just to say, we are definitely moving full steam ahead to help with a lot of the things that Rosalie spoke about. But just to finish off of saying what we believe the role for CADITH is, we know what the payers' problems are, because CADITH is regularly meeting with all the payers across the country. We know what good evidence looks like, and we know what the questions are that need to be answered to help people make decisions. So that's where we really see our role, is making sure good real world evidence is generated or found internationally to fill in the gaps, to start making decisions, and to perhaps in the future write managed entry agreements. What are we going to measure to say how much we should pay, for example? So I'll stop there just as a starter.
That's great. And Durhan has turned her video off, but hopefully she's still on audio. Maybe Chris McMaster, I mean, what's happening at CIHR that complements what CADITH is doing, or is a big part of that? And then I want to turn it over to some of the you know, the private sector solutions that are bubbling up, both from developers, but also the you know, the consulting world where they have big computers as well. So Chris, over to you first, and then we'll put it back out to learn about some of the neat AI stuff that's happening out there.
Thanks, Bill. I'm going to back it up to a bit more of a holistic approach that I still think is an issue with rare diseases, and then sort of drill down to the issue we're talking about right now. And I'll say, kind of from a holistic approach, I still think rare diseases are underappreciated as far as burden of health to the healthcare system, to the primarily kids who get rare diseases and their caregivers. And I think there's several reasons that are part of that. But I'll just give you some stats from studies that have come out over the last year for folks that don't, you know, follow this all the time. But in Ireland, they did an in-depth study, and they find 9 in 10 hospital bed stays and approximately 6 in 10 deaths under the age of 15 are due to rare diseases. Tenfold more of those due to childhood cancer, and 4 times more than death from external causes such as injury and poisoning. In Italy, years of general population life lost attributable rare diseases was 4 times those lost to infectious diseases and twice those for diabetes. And I think when you start to drill down to it, I could go on and on. You know, they looked in Australia, one Australian healthcare system, 10% of all hospital costs, children and adults combined, were for rare diseases, and it was 5 times greater than non-rare disease patients. In a recent study out of the States looked at genetic rare disorders, and they accounted for half of the US pediatric hospital inpatient bill. And so I think when we think of inherited and rare diseases, thinking them as a class of disease, it's inherited or rare/inherited disease is probably the way to go. And I think because right now, it's a quote from Gareth Bainham, he's a rare disease doctor of Australia, but he basically says, if these kids are not counted, they do not count. And I think right now, there's a bigger issue for me is that these kids still aren't counted within our healthcare system. And part of that is, for example, if you look at orphan codes, which people are familiar with, there's a couple hundred orphan codes currently in ICD-10, which folks use to, you know, which hospitals use to determine, you know, billing and enter administrative databases, et cetera. And we know there's about 7,000 orphan or rare diseases, a little more probably now. And yet these kids aren't counted in any administrative database, in any hospital database, any provincial or national database. We don't see these kids. Inherited disease should be at the top of every pediatric healthcare issue. And it's not there in terms of direct costs, indirect costs. We don't see it there. You'll see cystic fibrosis or muscular dystrophies at number 35 or number 52, but you're not going to see inherited disease as a class. And I think we need to think of them as a disease class. They're all, you know, 85% of them are monogenic single gene disorders, right? And so if we think of them as a disease class, they are by far the most costly, the most burdensome, and they cause more death. They cost more for in-hospital costs. Problem is right now, we can't count them accurately. And I think that's a huge issue when you're trying to approach government and you're trying to put and you're talking to pharma about what is the burden of this disease class. We can't count them properly. We're hosed. And so a few things I'll tell you about that CIHR is up to, and then I'll drill down to the issue. At least at our institute, there's a couple of things we're looking to do. And we asked some, you know, very smart economists, et cetera, say, could we actually get a really good read on morbidities, mortalities, and direct cost to the healthcare system, pediatric healthcare system? They said you absolutely cannot do that right now in Canada because we can't even find the kids accurately, never mind start to build any kind of economic argument, which is an issue. I think if you can't start to build your economic argument around what is the actual direct cost to the healthcare system, it makes it very difficult to then go to government to say you should be apportioning this much money to this issue. So I do think that's something we need to solve big time. The other thing we could get a handle on, though, is a little bit on the indirect costs for certain rare diseases. And so that's one of the things in terms of socioeconomic burdens or aspects of inherited and rare diseases that we are currently funding some grants to try and get a handle on. So what's these socioeconomic costs to families, caregivers, et cetera? And that's being funded through the Institute of Genetics. And we're also funding that through the European Joint Program on rare diseases as well, which is looking into social sciences and humanities research to improve healthcare implementation in everyday life of people living with rare diseases. So I think we might be able to get a handle on the socio and economic side, on the indirect cost side. But I still think it's going to be an issue on the direct cost side when you look at them as a disease class, as one disease class. And so I do think we need to start thinking of there's several other issues as well. I think the diagnostic odyssey, when we're thinking about trying to get treatments to kids in a timely manner, the diagnostic odyssey still exists in Canada, where it's 5 to 7 years before you end up seeing a medical geneticist who might order a genomic test. And in this day and age, with genomes being under $1,000, and you're thinking it's 25 grand before you get to the medical geneticist, 5 to 7 years, 2 to 3 misdiagnoses, we need to move genomics up to the early stages. And people have shown, if you look in the NICU, half of the kids that are there have an inherited disease. But they don't do genomes on kids who end up in the NICU as their first test. And you get a hit rate of over 50% right now when you actually do a genome to diagnose a kid in the NICU, and they'll have an inherited disease. So I think if we actually want to get to these kids, because a lot of these things actually don't even require expensive drugs, they just require a vitamin or removing something from a diet. It's really inexpensive that you can do. Now, there are others that will require expensive drugs, but we can't even find them early enough many times to actually get the treatment in place. So I do think we need to get our ducks in a row that way. And CHR will be starting to fund some grants to our institute in terms of changing the diagnostic paradigm in Canada, putting genomes first rather than last in the diagnostic pathway, so we can get them diagnosed under a year versus 5 to 7. And the other thing we need to add is, now that we can find them, we got to kind of do this in order. Let's get genomes done first so we can find the kids, and then we can start implementing orpha codes and get actual numbers on mortality, morbidity, direct costs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, so that we can show the magnitude of the problem. Because until we can define that as a disease class magnitude, I still think we get lost in amongst the individual diseases versus as a disease class. And then when I think you can show the huge burden and the cost, the price of the current drugs will no longer be as big an issue when you can say, look at the cost to the healthcare system right now, direct costs, indirect costs, outstrip everything by 5-fold for any other pediatric disease class. Nothing else comes close. And so once we can get our ducks in a row on that front, I think the arguments we can make around pricing and around need for many more therapies and access, as far as getting these kids the treatments that every other kid with many other diseases, pediatric cancer is the best one that you can look at, will just be clearly we have to do it. But I think it is really difficult right now because we just can't find the kids and we don't count them properly. And part of it's the diagnostic odyssey, part of it's orpha codes, and part of it's the lack of being able to come up with even indirect socio and economic measurements and burdens, never mind direct problems with mortalities, morbidities, and direct costs. These studies that are starting to come out now are really hard because people are having to go back through electronic health records and through paper records, depending on where you are, and in the absence of orpha codes, et cetera, do them one at a time and say, okay, this kid actually had an inherited disease, but it wasn't counted or coded that way, which is why it's so laborious and long right now to do these types of studies.
So Chris, I'm hearing you say, and this is, I saw Rosalie's head nodding, that maybe we're counting individual drugs going through the system and then the burden of the illness of that individual kid on caregivers and the health system. If we start to aggregate these things differently and think about them as more broadly, then the solutions will be there. And I did put in the chat group yesterday some new IQVIA data around the dynamics around drug expenditures. And it actually shows that Canada spends 10% of its healthcare budget on drugs, which is well below the 15% of the major markets, because they actually looked at the aggregate value of all the discounts coming in, which is around 35%, but we never talk about that. And to put that in perspective, we're just ahead of the UK in terms of proportion of healthcare spending on drugs. So if we start to aggregate these things and count things differently, and that's what Rosalie, you pitched at the beginning, where maybe we'll see things from a different light, and the answer won't be, just focus on the price of drug X to solve the world's problem. Maybe we need to take a more holistic perspective. I'd love to hear from some of the private sector solution providers and the drug developer. In fact, cystic fibrosis, as you know, Christina, if you've been monitoring the chat group, has been, maybe we can start with you, because that's been coming up. And Kim Steele is very active, thanks Kim, from CF Canada, talking about their registry and doing their best to measure stuff. And then we'll bring it back out to Chris Pantavir, and you'll tell me how to pronounce it, Chris. But Christina, can you react to what you've heard from CIHR and Rosalie so far?
Yeah, I mean, we had our latest therapy just go through the process, and we had really significant achievements for the CF community. Now, I preface this all with the fact that, the CF community patients did an extraordinary job creating awareness and really driving, I think, collaboration with the government agencies to really focus on this file. So the therapy is Trikafta, and it obviously treats patients, 90% of patients with cystic fibrosis. And the experience with Trikafta really is a great example of where government bodies, I believe, came together, worked with the patient community, worked with the clinician community. And obviously CADIF, INES, Health Canada were hugely responsible for helping us. We did the joint assessments. So we did participate in aligning our reviews with them, which I think significantly contributed to a decrease in timelines. So for example, we had Health Canada approval, and in about 150 days, we had 95% public access. So that is typically 665 days, I believe, before you can achieve those milestones. So this is pretty significant, and we certainly participated in those, and we're very thankful that we did, and we're very thankful that CADIF also agreed to allow observational studies within their review, which was certainly very helpful for the patient community. There's a large patient subset group with a high unmet need, and we were able to achieve access for them. Now, these are very unique circumstances, I think. Not every drug has this type of visibility, both within the system, but also within the patient community, and those trying to help us achieve access. It was significantly challenging to even bring this therapy to Canada. I cannot understate that. PMPRB was creating additional challenges, and I think for us as a manufacturer and most rare disease manufacturers, given the complexity of the PMPRB, it took us a long time to digest what was happening and then just make the call to submit in Canada regardless. That was significant for us, and it did create timelines. So while government agencies really did work very hard to ensure access post Health Canada review, there were a lot of moving parts, and I cannot thank enough those Canadian bodies that did do that, including the provinces that worked with us on PLA so quickly. It was significant, but there are still those environmental challenges. We've spoken about the ones, and very happy to hear from Lori and CADIF talking about managed access programs, real world evidence. That's all significantly important and will be for the CF community in the future as well. But there are significant challenges that remain with PMPRB. Like, this is a whole systemic challenge for the rare disease community, and a manufacturer's perspective is just one of those. So I can only speak from the very operational elements of how a manufacturer views the environment in Canada. And Kim does an excellent job of that impact on the patient community, which is significant. This, the amount of work that the CF community did to raise awareness with payers was significant, and it's too big of a burden. And the rare disease community does not need to have to do that to facilitate access. So from our perspective, just to kind of go sort of end things, because I don't want to take up too much time, but there were significant things that worked for Trikafta, and it meant a great deal. There are significant challenges that remain, and as one of the manufacturers in this space, I know sitting with the Rare Eye Group, all of the industry is committed to finding and working with government bodies. This is not antagonistic. We all want to collaborate to find solutions for patient needs in Canada. But I do leave it with, while I'm optimistic, it's been years we've been hearing about these managed access programs and all the rest of it, and we're very excited about the potential progress.
Yeah, so let's go for some solutions now and it'd be great to get some dialogue going between, and thank you, Christina. That was great for the roadmap for Trikafta and the flag that this is, that it was, will probably shine some light on some gaps. But I think the interesting news is that we've got some solutions providers that hopefully are keeping an eye on what CADTH is doing in CIHR and contributing to it and really aligning with it. So maybe over to you, Chris and Suzanne, to tell us what's going on with your big brains and computers for how we can think about these things differently from a data perspective.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in first. So first of all, Pentavere, although I'm starting to question everything I thought I knew to be true. It's really great to be part of this conversation. I think, we're talking about some challenges, but I think this is a really optimistic and really exciting time to be part of this conversation. And this group and the efforts of CORD is, CADTH, CIHR, all the people on this call are really leading the way. So it is an exciting time, I think. I'm a clinician. I remember when I first started, talking to other clinicians, learning kind of about rare diseases. The thing that came up consistently, and I'm so glad we're so aligned. We've heard it from Rosalie, from Laurie, from Chris. The biggest challenge, or one of the biggest challenges affecting rare diseases, is the lack of complete evidence. Is this evidence gap, whether it's whether it's identifying patients, whether it's supporting outcome-based agreements, whether it's monitoring. The lack of consistent evidence is one of the biggest challenges affecting the rare disease space. And that, for me and kind of my journey into this space, and that was exactly my challenge too. We live in this kind of interesting world at the moment where on the one hand, kind of data, evidence, knowledge we've been told is doubling in the clinical space and the medical space every year. Yet on the other hand, we can't find rare disease patients. We can't understand our own kind of clinical population, our institution population, what works, what doesn't. I think that's where real world evidence, real world data comes into play. And that's exactly the work we're focused on at Pentavere. We're a health technology company based in Toronto, and we've managed to solve that problem of understanding clinical text. And in doing so, we're able to solve and work towards solving that problem of lacking evidence. Because really, the good news in all of this, and I think it's been alluded to a number of times, is that all of the data we need, all of the kind of answers we need for so many of these questions are transcribed in the electronic health record, right? For years now, across the UK, across Europe, across North America, electronic health records have become the norm and are capturing all of that data. But I think, as Chris mentioned, the standards to go and access that, to look into that, is essentially manual chart review, incredibly time consuming, incredibly expensive. Two things that are particularly relevant, the time issue. Rare disease patients don't have time, right? So how do we shorten that? How do we scale the work that's being done? I think when people think about AI, particularly in rare diseases, they'll often think about protein folding. They'll often think about drug discovery, which is good. That's right. That's important work. But we know that 90% of these patients don't have drugs available to them, and even when they have drugs available to them, how are we getting those drugs to market quicker? How are we getting the right patients on the right drugs identified and then on them quicker? And I think that's really where real world data and real world evidence comes into play. And that
Chris?
kind of brings. Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah, I'm just, because I think what you're saying is so important, and my experience in all my years and in the meetings I'm having recently, same issues coming up. And I just want to, clinicians work so hard, to care for their patients, and they're trying to collect this data and real world evidence as well. But over and over, if clinicians just had support, like Durham talks about infrastructure, like how do we help? To me personally, from even before starting at CADTH, But if clinicians just were given support, you know, to be able to collect the data, as they said, they're already writing down in one form or another. I just think, you know, I every time I almost am in tears listening to clinicians. The one the other day, well, at night I try and go home and enter the data into the registry. Like, that's just crazy, you know?
It's so true, and that, you know, that's the reality of the kind of world we're kind of currently living in. And Doreen said, let's talk about the future. The future should be now. There's no reason this can't be now. The technology exists. I'm actually, you know, I can share because the embargo listed today. Next week we're presenting at ESMO, where our technology reviewed 8,000 patients across Alberta to drill down into the specific cohort that was answering the question on the lung cancer patient. So not rare disease, but kind of a rare condition, you know, very specific condition. A couple of weeks ago, we presented at World Lung data that showed this technology is now better than manual chart review. It's more accurate than manual chart review. And so that's kind of, you know, that's the state of play, you know, where the technology is now. We shouldn't be expecting clinicians who are already struggling to keep up or already struggling to understand the breadth and scale of the data to be also collecting it in these different ways. They're already collecting the information. The technology is there to ingest it, to bring it together, to analyze it, make sense of it. So we should be deploying it. And I think, you know, I have a dream where all clinicians everywhere essentially, you know, have the knowledge of the specialist that you want to be treating that rare disease patient, so that patients can be identified quicker, we can be put on the right drugs quicker, so that we can have the evidence to support, you know, these outcome-based agreements or these kind of managed access programs. And I think, you know, maybe my one challenge to the group and to take forward is, given the opportunity that presents itself now, you know, with the investment, from the government, you know, how are we going to push for, you know, whether it's a national advisory on data collection or data access, or it's a national approach to, to kind of building those registries. How do we, and I guess, you know, to Laurie's point, to Rosalie's point earlier, how do we ensure that the small siloed learnings from specific pilots, from the work we're doing, you know, in different areas, from the work lots of, you know, people are doing in different areas, how do we ensure that scales and so it's benefiting, you know, all patients across Canada? You know, I'm obviously not from Canada originally, but you know, I'm here. You know, the consequence of my decisions mean that my children are now Canadian. They're going to be Canadian patients. We're invested in this system, and you know, how do we ensure that we continue to improve and continue to be world leading? You know, we heard about the kind of great feedback we're getting from Africa earlier. How do we ensure that Canada stays there? And so that's my only challenge. I think this is really optimistic. This is an exciting time to be in AI and to be doing this sort of work, but there are challenges ahead, I think. I'm going to pause there. Sorry, I can get very carried away.
No.
Hopefully, Doreen gives me the opportunity to have a whole webinar sometime.
Well, she's already committed to, Chris, so heads up on that. And Laurie, thanks for jumping in. But I think this is what you said, Chris, is you're saying you're challenging everyone. Suzanne, from where you sit, I believe you're in Calgary, if I'm not mistaken, right? It's great to have you.
Yeah, our company is based in Calgary. A similar perspective as Christopher. We basically do health outcomes research largely to support industry and bringing drugs to market. And I work in the real world evidence side of that. Definitely agree with all the statements that the other panelists have said today in terms of the challenges and barriers, but as well as the opportunities that are available to us. From our perspective, one of the key challenges that we faced is similar to what Christopher McMaster said. It is identifying those patients. Largely using administrative data, this is hard to do. The ICD codes aren't there. They're not at that level of granularity that's needed. We recently did a study in SMA and have published, and while we can identify SMA, we can't get it at the type. So we're able to show the burden of illness and the cost to society, or cost to the from the healthcare perspective, but using proxies by the age of the patient from their first appearance in the healthcare system as a proxy for that SMA type. So whether or not those are acceptable, they're approximates for the burden of illness. And to supplement that though, the societal burden is substantial, particularly for these illnesses in children. The caregiver aspect, we put quite a bit of time into collecting both the patient and caregiver burden. And so accounting for that societal burden, I think, is a huge part of the picture that needs to be recognized. But to overcome some of those issues, there are a few approaches we've been doing similar to Christopher. Looking at the electronic health records, that level of detail is substantial and necessary. So using tools such as natural language processing to work through large amounts of unstructured physician notes or unstructured lab data has been advantageous. The other way that you can then use that is using developing an algorithm for identifying these patients. You can validate it in a smaller subset of patient health records and then roll it out into administrative data where you can try and find these larger populations, specifically for those incredibly rare diseases, where finding those charts can be very hard to do. So if you can validate an algorithm, it can help potentially find other patients even without those ICD codes. Additionally, the genetic testing, we're starting to see more uptake of that in the admin data, and that's been hugely helpful as it can be another tool within that algorithm for identifying the patients. So I think that's a really optimistic future. We're seeing those changes that can then be, we can take advantage of that and pull out the larger data. Sorry, Laura, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise with what you're talking about that, you know, again, that I've been doing this for a long time, but I think we want to take things from all sides. So we want to use ICD code like what's already there. But right, there's lots of examples of clinicians working together to determine this is how we're going to code something.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're talking rare disease, we might be talking, you know, 5 to 10 centers across Canada that they can just agree, this is how we're going to code. I have examples from Quebec where they just made up, you know, they added a letter on the end of the code to signify that's one of these patients, for example, or that is this procedure. So I think, right, you want to do it from all sides. So look at what we have with CIHI and Stats Canada, but let's all work together as well to try and make things more precise.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. And then the other aspect that we try to work on is with those managed entry agreements that was spoken about earlier, trying to understand how do we actually obtain that real world evidence going forward. So working with industry who's trying to bring their drug to market to plan for the real world evidence strategy early on. And often within that larger data sets, we have to use surrogate endpoints. It's not always possible to get that clinical endpoint. So trying to, I think for us, the next steps where support would be helpful is guidance on what will be accepted. And so that we can help prepare that data so it's ready to go, where we have our code written on these populations, we've identified cohorts, and then we continuously pull open year data and are able to provide those outcomes in a timely manner. And
exactly on the same page, Suzanne, you know, and that's what CADITH is doing, is dealing with the payers and knowing what they want. And we know what good quality evidence is. And so together we work out, again, what are those outcomes that we need that everyone's going to trust, and we'll make decisions based on them, right?
Exactly. So I think that's the future for this area. It's quite exciting. The other thing that we're seeing a little bit more of is increasing collaboration. From the industry perspective, data accessibility has always been a challenge. Often, you know, provincial data sets aren't available from an industry perspective, or the health electronic records, but we're seeing more collaboration, registries being set up in advance. These are all steps that are really positive and give us another opportunity for data access to help address some of these research questions. So I'm similar to Christopher, I'm very optimistic in the future for rare diseases and the type of research that we can do to expand in this area.
Well, Durhan, I was mentioning you're going to do a webinar to help highlight this. Do you want to jump back in? And I saw Rosalie had her hand up too.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll let Rosalie answer, but I'm going to put the question out there. Maybe Rosalie just will lead into it, because I'm going to take a little page out of what was done at the Best Brains Exchange, because what we really want to do is look really future. And I know in the rare disease space, the most exciting therapies that are going to be coming through are these cell and gene therapies, those durable therapies. And hold your breath, our use of the word curable, diseases now. These are very different from anything that we've done before. So recognizing we've got at least 200 of these in the pipeline. You heard yesterday, there's a host of them just for, the retinopathy. So what are we going to do? If you were to make a suggestion and looking out, over the next 2 years, over the next 3 years, we've got these therapies, maybe even 5 years coming up. What would be the most important kinds of investments that Canada should make so that when these therapies are coming through, we can say, okay, you guys, we're ready. We've already done this. We've put this infrastructure in place. We've got these people lined up here. We're already looking at these kinds of financing models. And you can speak, certainly from your own perspective. Don't need to take the whole thing out. I'm going to put you guys all on the hot spot. You're my experts. You're going to help us design this in the future. If we were to say, we have $1 billion, we need to invest it, what would you like to put your hands up to say, here's where we think we ought to go? Because we got these slew of gene therapies coming down the pike, and we want to make them available to people as soon as possible, but obviously in a way that's going to be safe and also going to give us that future information about what's cost effective.
Well, I guess I'll respond to your question a little bit and maybe just throw in, I had just a few maybe follow-up comments on sort of some of what the other panelists have said. I really think that a key piece of the puzzle is really what we've kind of been focusing on as a panel, which is ensuring that real world evidence is there, that we can get, as far as we can on advanced diagnostics and identifying patients, because there is sort of just in terms of getting access and getting through trials, there's the practical challenges of ensuring you have the largest, a good patient group. And Canada as a population is diverse. We have good researchers. I mean, I think we have a really good value proposition for really being a testing and proving ground for the value of new and innovative therapies. But to do that, we need to be able to identify patients from our relatively small population. We need to really be able to, enable the aggregation of that evidence. And so I think really the sort of the front end on diagnostics and then sort of the back end of real world monitoring post-treatment are two key pillars to really making that value proposition for Canada that much better. And just one thing I wanted to sort of just highlight, and it's a bit of a digression, so no one needs to respond to it, just sort of wanted to add, was just when we're thinking about caregiver burden to the system, there's a growing interest in that from the aging population perspective. And granted, it's a completely different population, but there's some similarities where treatments are generally more expensive at that age of life, as well that it's at the end of the day, it's either the children caring for parents or parents caring for children. It becomes a family thing, but there's a broad cost to society that is interesting to ministers of finance and revenue and those people that you need to get on your side to really, make sure the dollars get spent. Well, for one thing, the dollars keep flowing and that they go to where they should. And I think that focusing on the costs to caregivers and the burden that causes down the pipeline for, say, labor productivity, the functioning of the overall economy, really blowing it out to that macro can, I think there might be allies in the rare disease discussion that might not be where you would traditionally think of finding them, but in this new landscape, I just was sort of, the analogy to the work we're doing in seniors care was just stood out to me. So just adding that thought there, and sort of last follow-up, and I will shut up, is just in talking about sort of the data aggregation. There's some really interesting things going on in Ontario in terms of aggregating administrative hospital records and data sets, but then we get into complicated issues of IP ownership. And so just, I'm not going to say we should go there today, but since we're pitching other webinars, if we want to go down the pipeline, I think that there's something to do with data and IP. The IP piece of the puzzle is, I think, key to actually not just having the data available, but actually having it functionally used.
That was absolutely amazing. We got our nickel, dime, and quarter source from you on that, Rosalie. And you not only gave us, I think, some really important comments around the question I was asking, but brought us back to also a hugely important population. And that is looking at those that are aging, looking at rare diseases that affect people later in life. And many of us who have older relatives and are also dealing with that. I mean, yes, of course, as we all know, 80% of these diseases affect, are genetic, they affect children, they're discovered early in life, but many are not. And I think this is such an important part. And we need to also be able to look at, I mean, certainly the socioeconomic burden in terms of, aging populations with rare and other chronic diseases is a hugely important factor. And now we're getting more and more therapies that are really targeted at that population. I mean, as we've seen with ALS, with Alzheimer's, and hopefully some of those that we have not actually seen yet. So thanks so much for that. You may be on the spot for another targeted webinar, because we really need to look at the aging population. Thanks ever so much. Chris, I feel like you've got a Christmas present that you're just dying to open. So I'm going to toss it over to you.
Thanks, Durhan. Well, I'm just gonna, some thoughts that we've been having at CIHR at the Institute of Genetics, and we're working with Health Canada, as you know, through the Best Brains Exchange we had, that we're trying to work with them on their innovative clinical trials regulation in terms of coming up with more of a platform approach for AAV vectors in terms of the approval process. So right now, every therapy is a new therapy, but if you've got something on the AAV8 backbone and you're just replacing the cargo, the gene, how much of the PK, PD, ADME do you have to rinse and repeat over and over and over again to get the thing approved? And I think if industry and the public sector folks who are moving forward on clinical trials would take more of an open science approach to putting this data out there in terms of what are the standard measurements you need for your sort of CTA or IND enabling studies for these vectors, and work with Health Canada to aggregate that data, it could save everybody a lot of time and a lot of money moving forward if you could take more of an open science, collegial, collaborative approach, so that the pathway to approval through Health Canada would then be a lot simpler for all the therapies coming behind it on that same backbone, if you just got a few folks together using the same backbones to talk. So I think if industry and the public sector can get together on that front, I think that would be a big help. I also think if you're thinking about how to spend money, Durhan, I think we do need some rare disease natural history networks, and we need a clinical trials network for rare and inherited diseases in Canada. Both those things need to be set up with that cash for sure. I think these things will also dovetail with the government's new focus on biomanufacturing, because right now they're looking at AAV vector biomanufacturing with the pandemic and future pandemics in mind. But if you're looking at AAV vector manufacturing primarily through NRC and collaborators, well, it's going to be a lot of AAV vectors are what's being used for inherited disease. So what are you going to do in the meantime between pandemics once you ramp everything up? Well, if NRC, and I know they're keen to start thinking about biomanufacturing AAV vectors, but also putting the secret sauce out into the open for people to say, this is our GMP process for how to get AAV vectors manufactured and scaled up for use in patients for anybody to use. And instead of, trying to take more of a patented approach, it's the government dollars spending money on healthcare, which is our biggest expense in the country. So they're thinking reevaluating, maybe they should just make it more of an open science process so that anybody, industry or public sector folks could take a look at these things and move them forward in a more economic way. So I think there's a lot of things within government that we could spend the money on and to make it faster, easier, cheaper to get access to these therapies. And I think it would benefit the private sector at the same time if they saw how some of the folks were manufacturing and making AAV vectors that could inform, but also if they were willing to share PK, PD, ADME data for some of their AAV trials in aggregate, it could help Health Canada actually find a platform approach to AAV vectors versus every one being a brand new drug. That's how I'd spend some of the money, Durhan.
Chris, I think you just emptied out my Santa Claus bag, but that's okay, because I know you're going to refill it with all the ways in which you're going to be able to generate income and to return. But certainly, I will have to say, sitting here in Africa, a lot of what you're saying are some of the solutions that are actually being championed here. And I don't think any of us think that open science is the enemy of, private industry. And that the ability for the public-private sector at this level is absolutely essential. Nobody's going to think that open science will totally replace all of the innovation and development. And in fact, all it will do is add to it. And certainly, again, from what we've learned, right? There are ways in which we can reward innovation. We can certainly, I don't think any of us would be wrong in suggesting that, Pfizer, Moderna, and everyone, J&J, and all these companies are making money out of these vaccines at the same time being able to donate and contribute to developing countries. So we need to keep all those things in mind, including the development in. So thanks a whole lot for that. I don't know, Bill. I think we're going to have to push the launch into October, given all the special topics that we're actually seeing come to the table. But really appreciate it. Lori, over to you.
Yeah. And then just a quick warning on time. We're going to try to wrap this up in about 7 minutes. But Lori, and then
okay. I'll be quick to just say, to follow up from Chris, is if we get the infrastructure to measure natural history and the burden, we can then build on that. Then a treatment is introduced. We just build on that same platform and we start measuring what's the impact on process, what's the impact on outcomes. So, start with natural history, and then we keep building and enhancing on those platforms to collect data.
That's great. And just with the few minutes that we have remaining, we have about 5 minutes. Christina, I know you're looking at the next generation of potentially gene-focused therapies continuing in rare, not just CF. Do you have any thoughts, having heard what's happening in the public sector and some of the new innovations coming out of private sector solutions too? Where are the developers on this?
Yeah, for sure. We have pipeline into many other areas, and the newborn screening, the inequity across provinces on newborn screening is a big one. For sure, and paying attention to that inequity and why it exists and the barriers that exist. Being able to identify patients, impacts the entire kind of holistic approach to how manufacturers look at these things. So that's a big one. Another one really is also understanding the full burden of care. I think, even when we try to dig into some of the data around, hospitalization rates, transplant rates, all those types of things, it's so piecemeal across the system, it's really hard to aggregate the full costs. So even for us, when we're trying to make those or have those conversations with payers, having a real well-rounded understanding of what a patient's actually costing the system is really important. I think those two elements obviously are sort of newer for us, because being in the CF space, we actually have a good, kind of idea. The CF Canada has one of the best registries in the world, and we're able to leverage that. But that's not the case in every area, and it's really expensive. And there's a lot of things associated with that, huge burden on the physician community. But it's all towards a good cause. So how can we kind of leverage some of those learnings and bring them forward is really important, I think.
Excellent. We're building a bit of an Eastside Mario's menu here of what different investments might cost. I hope we get free garlic bread with this meal potentially, but I think that's the challenge that you put out there, Durhan. What do we do? You said push it out to October, but this money is going to start flowing on April 1st. We've got a short list of really neat ideas coming out of today and yesterday. Chris, over to you, and then maybe back to Durhan to sort of wrap up in terms, and then kick us into the next panel.
Sure. I just really wanted to take a minute just to kind of double down on Chris's point and Laurie's point about the kind of natural progression or the natural history of these patients and what isn't understood, and really challenge while patients are of course at the center of everything we do, really make the point that I think we have the opportunity available to us. The technology exists. where we can journalize these patients, years after their diagnosis. We can take that data and make sense of it. Derhan's seen this technology and seeing how we can, compare patient with patient across Canada, across data sets, and really start to understand, the natural progression of these patients, the history of these patients, and to Laurie's point, continue to build on that, continue to have that data grow in its usefulness and utility over time to support these drugs as they're being approved and being kind of delivered to the patient population. And so I think we do really have an opportunity to think big here, and it impact many thousands, millions of patients in a really, really meaningful way.
Thanks so much. Any final thoughts before I turn it back to Derhan to sort of reflect from Cord on what we've heard on visualizing the plan? Because I think there's so many nuggets that are coming out of this that it's funny, Derhan, the way that you created this conference, it's always neat to see how it comes together. You started with the science on gene therapy and some of the amazing things that are coming down the pipe. And then right into the clinical centers of excellence, the amazing research that are already happening. And then we talked about the gaps and the challenges. This is bringing it back into the solutions. And let's stop wringing our hands and actually get to work doing it. But what are your key takeaways from this panel? Because you're going to end it with David Page and with others that are also full of solutions that are very patient-centric. And I just want to have one quick shout out here to David, who's going to lead us off into the next one. We talked about clinicians charting data, everything. Maybe we're going to nudge David to talk about it. He said patients can also chart and tell us more about their own health state and what's going on. So that's a source of data. We can't just turn to the docs and the clinicians and the registered nurse practitioners. And just thank you everyone in the chat for keeping this going as well. Derhan, any final notes before we head into the next panel?
This has been really a very, very wholesome discussion. As you say, we generated so much out of it. We're not going to move the date to next October. We'll just do more things after we get started. But quite frankly, I think we also appreciate, though, it's not an easy solution. There's nothing that says, okay, we can just sort of implement this. We'll collect some real world data. We'll do some of the post monitoring, and we'll analyze it against what we thought was going to happen. And Bob's your uncle, and we've got plan. So the other thing that's very exciting, of course, is seeing the pieces starting to come together and the many players coming together. And I think it's very, very fruitful when we think about some of the key things we see. We've seen the public-private partnerships underlie it, and that public includes the patient organizations. It includes, obviously, our public agencies. It also includes, I think, some of the research institutes and the foundations that we're talking about. How do we bring them in more tightly? And looking at then, as we say, what's happening in terms of I think Rosalie was great in terms of talking about some of the other private entities that we have not talked about. So I think that will really help us. I hope that we can, we have not been good in Canada. We're not even very good in the US, where, private industry has such a stranglehold in being able to do these well. Europe does it better, but even Europe, I think there's lots of struggles. And I think it's because in many cases, you're bringing sort of naturally different vested interests together. And you're basically, what I call strange bedfellows, right? I need you, you need me. We don't really like each other. We don't really trust each other, but hey, we got to be in bed together. So off we go and we'll make the best of it. I think what we're hearing here is that we're going to move beyond that. I actually begin to like some of you folks. So this is important. We don't think of, the regulators and the HTA folks and the payers as our natural enemies. We don't think of the industry as out to try to, choose the quickest and the fastest way that they can get to be the cost return so they can move on to the next products. But we all know that, right? And so I think this is a huge opportunity for us to do things that are very, very different. And I can't tell you how excited I am to hear what we're doing, but I also love it because I'm sitting here in Africa and I have that global context in my mind. And I think what we're doing has so many important translations to what can benefit not just Canada, but really benefit and be models for global. So looking forward to it. I really hope that we can save all of the chats, because we do need to distill out the products, the projects that might come. And I think this is the perfect segue to kind of what we did yesterday as well. Here's kind of where we've been. Here's some of the possible solutions here, but to really get us talking about how to put it together, let's also look at some of the challenges that are still there. And there's no better person, I think, than David Page to help us in terms of kicking off this very next session. I think all of you, anybody who's been in any of our sessions, have seen David in many of his iterations. David is the one person I know who is not only a patient, but also a scientist, is also a great communicator, is also a great educator. And you know, he's absolutely the perfect person. When I need somebody to do science and make it intelligent to a lay person, David's one of those people that immediately come to mind. But when I also need a patient to stick in front of policymakers or scientists to be able to express the patient perspective in a way that they get it, David's also that person. So David's one of my rare beasts in terms of, you know, whatever you need him to be, he's there ready to do that. So David's going to start us off and giving us a little bit of a case study.
Yeah,
yes.
I just wanted to say thank you to Chris and Suzanne and Lori. The last panel, I loved how it went. So David, you're going to play the role of Rosalie this time. Kick us off. You have co-host control, so you can share screen now. And just to give a quick note, we're going to be joined by longtime CORD member, past board member, and patient advocate extraordinaire Maureen Smith in a little while as well. We've got Thea DeSepola, Vice President of Health Policy and Patient Access at Novartis, who's going to come into this discussion as well. We've got Christian Hansen, International Business Lead of Acute Care at Alexion. Peter Brenders, General Manager at Beijing, Canada, and longtime friend of CORD. Jessica Burko, Director of Government and Regulatory Affairs at Sun Life Financial. So we're going to hear a bit from the private insurance perspective. And then another friend from out west, or I should always say Glenn, because you're actually from down east, if that makes sense, but you were then out west, senior public sector executive and now senior associate of health and life sciences at Global Public Affairs. Just to set people up to know who is going to be reacting and jumping in after. David, you kick it off on meaningful patient engagement. So over to you, David, and yeah, we'll get everyone back on shortly. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Phil. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Good. And thanks, Johan, for that. I think that's the nicest introduction I've ever had. Johan and I go back more than 30 years. And we've done lots of stuff together. So thanks for the invitation to talk about meaningful patient engagement. So I'm going to tell you the story of advocating for access to a novel therapy. The timing is right, because at the end, I can tell you whether we succeeded or failed. My disclosures, I have one, I am very biased. I'm not affected by this therapy myself, but I have many friends and colleagues with hemophilia A who could benefit from this therapy. So we're talking about an innovative therapy called emicizumab, a monoclonal antibody, or Hemlibra is the brand name, for Canadians with hemophilia A. I have B, so I'm not affected. A few words about hemophilia A. It's a genetic disorder, genetic disorder, 1 in 8,000 births. But only 30% have the severe form of the disease, deficiency in factor VIII protein, manifested by bleeding into joints, knees, elbows, ankles, especially. Severe forms are usually fatal by the age of 20 if not treated. And 75% of people in the world are not treated. And Johan was telling me this morning about someone at her conference in Ghana who told a very sad story. So that's the world. You know, we need something for the world, not just for Canadians. Fortunately, we have a really good network of treatment centers across Canada, 26 of them, and an excellent bleeding disorder registry, which actually patients contribute most of the data to that registry, as treatment is mainly done at home. And so patients report their regular treatments and symptoms. A bit of history on treatment. So human factor VIII was the mainstay, has been the mainstay ever since 1950 in more and more, in safer and safer and more efficacious forms, all the way to recombinant human factor VIII. But as of 2018, there's a new player, a monoclonal antibody called emicizumab. And it was really important for us to make sure this came to market and became available, because there's a whole pipeline of things, whether they're other MABs, RNAi, anti-TFPIs, et cetera, and gene therapy, which could be approved in the next, perhaps the next 2 years. So there's a whole panoply of exciting developments. Just to compare the new and the traditional, you can see the half-life is much longer with this, and that means administration is only once a week. It can be subcutaneous as well instead of intravenous, and the intravenous was often central venous access devices, so very burdensome. In terms of neutralizing anti-drug antibodies, very low in case of emicizumab, but 30% of babies develop inhibitors to factor VIII. Efficacy, this new therapy maintains a 15% equivalent level of factor VIII, as opposed to factor VIII, where the target is really maintaining a trough level before the next infusion of only 1%. So you can imagine that at 1%, this therapy may be life-saving, it may be limb-saving, but it doesn't render the person normal. Emicizumab can be used both with patients with inhibitors and without inhibitors to factor VIII. And in terms of efficacy, certainly it leads to less bleeding into joints based on real-world evidence. A bit about the access system. We have our own mini pharmacare in Canada through Canadian Blood Services. So all plasma protein products, or they should go through that process. And that means we don't have to deal with 13 governments. We only have to deal with really 2 sets of governments, Quebec and the rest of Canada. Health technology assessments are a bit different in that in Quebec, a transfusion medicine committee is also involved in the health technology assessment. And in the rest of Canada, CBS also has a role to play along with CADIF. And then the decisions on reimbursement in the rest of Canada are made by one group. So that's 9 plus 3, everybody except Quebec. So we only had to deal with 2 decision-making processes. And then there's a national procurement system through Canadian Blood Services, and then a separate one for Quebec. So our first advocacy effort was to, and this was before approval, was to convince Quebec and the other PTs that this new therapy should be reviewed as a plasma protein product, because it's not a plasma protein product. And the arguments we made were that it was a substitute for factor VIII, it was a biological drug, had the same function as factor VIII, prescribed the same way, and as an expensive treatment for a rare disease, had the same need for national procurement and also pharmacovigilance through our registry. And we won that argument. So even before approval, we knew it was coming through this pathway for reimbursement. The approval came about the same time as FDA and EMA. So there was no delay in terms of Health Canada approving this product. And there was a 2-step process for inhibitors first, and then for without inhibitors next. So the second effort was to get it approved for those with inhibitors. And so we did a submission to the HTA agencies. We presented the research data, written and video testimonials, references to international reports, but probably the most important thing, which we actually did a detailed comparison of the cost of this new treatment versus current treatments. And we showed very clearly that there would be savings of $3 million per month. So this was the best of both worlds, a much more efficacious treatment and savings. It looked like a pretty easy argument to make. So we continued up with letters, meetings with officials, frequent communications with the manufacturer and with blood services, but still no decision for 9 months. This cost $27 million to the health system. And then we were approached by a family whose son had an inhibitor, and his drug cocktail to keep him healthy and alive cost $6 million a year, despite the fact that you had an alternative which was far more efficacious and far cheaper. So what happened? Was it a coincidence that the media coverage in the Globe and Mail happened on the 5th of May, and in the next few weeks, decisions were made in Quebec and the rest of Canada to fund this drug for all inhibitor patients? I don't think it was a coincidence. We moved on to advocacy effort number 3, which was for those without an inhibitor. And the health benefits are not as dramatic because factor VIII is quite efficacious in patients. Not perfect, but certainly life-saving. And there were more people involved, 1,000 people with severe hemophilia A versus only 100 with inhibitors. And there was perception based on the price in the US that there would be a huge budget impact. And so we were pushing uphill. There were 3 separate HTA processes. Ines went through 2 and Cadith went through 1 over the last 2.5 years. And meanwhile, emicizumab became standard of care in US, all through Europe, Japan, Australia, etc. So we were definitely behind the rest of the world. We've made another new submission. This one is to Cadith. We made similar ones to Ines. We presented a survey of people's lived experience, which we did ourselves online. And it showed high physical, psychosocial, and socioeconomic burden of disease, a high burden of treatment. Remember, this is IV, several times a week, sometimes with a central venous access device, and that there was impact on the entire family. We're also able to present data from PROBE. PROBE is the patient-reported outcomes burden and experiences study. This is a patient-designed, patient-run, patient-managed research tool looking into what patients think are important in terms of outcomes. And this is a bit of the data that we were able to present. We also include people with no bleeding disorder as controls. So we were able to show that people with severe hemophilia A use mobility devices much more frequently, have much more difficulties with activities of daily living, much more use of pain medication. They are less likely to be working full-time or part-time, and that they're more likely to be either retired early, unemployed, or on long-term disability. So we were able to provide information that no, hemophilia A has not been solved. It's still a problem. So what happened? Emicizumab, the first Ines recommendation said, no, don't add it to the Hemo-Quebec formulary. And you can see all the reasons that you've probably seen in many HTA reports. And I'm afraid I have to say that even though the patients were involved in the process quite nicely, the patient perspective was discounted in the decision document. So we asked them to review again, and the manufacturer submitted again. And a year later, Ines said no again. Different reasons, weak methodology, biases, et cetera, despite the rest of the world having made the transition to this product. What about Cadith? Well, Cadith at the same time said yes. So we have a no from one side and a yes from the other side. Only for people with severe disease, we can live with that. That's where the research was done. Only under the care of a hemophilia specialist, that makes perfect sense. And this one didn't make sense. Only if less costly than the least costly factor VIII. Well, there are many factor VIIIs at different prices. It makes no sense that an innovation, which is an advance in therapy, has to be cheaper than the least costly of the competitors. So what did we do? We had to do another budget impact. So we did a full economic analysis of the market using publicly available data on pricing and utilization. And we're able to come to the conclusion that at a certain cost of X, emicizumab could be introduced with no budget impact compared to current costs. And so we shared this with CVS and with the payers to try to counteract our perception stemming from the Cadith report. We also involved our members. So we had an online letter writing campaign, and we had 10,000 letters written to ministers of health and local members of the legislatures in the first month of our campaign. So certainly the word was out that the membership was behind this. Other efforts, these are, we collaborated with the hemophilia doctors to critique the INES report. They said the methodology was flawed with a rare disorder. The doctors themselves wrote to the Quebec Ministry of Health to support access. They were united. We had some more television and newspaper stories, and we did a lot of behind the scenes advocacy with Quebec hematologists, not just in hemophilia, but across the field, with the Quebec Ministry of Health and with the political staff of the Ministry of Health. So what were the results? We're coming to the present now. So the MSS overruled INES, and I think that's quite rare, and added Hemlibra to the formulary, but said that it's not interchangeable with factor VIII for children 4 years and less, who represent 5% of severe patients, but it is interchangeable for those 5 years and up. Now, interchangeable to me means it's the same ingredient in the same dose, given in the same way, but that's not what Quebec thinks. Quebec thinks, well, I guess it's interchangeable if they say it is. And so the question now is, will it be sent to a future tender, an appel d'offre, in direct competition with factor VIII? So we're still waiting to see what the outcome of that is. But for the moment, only 5% of the severe patients, and these are the children under 4, have access. In the rest of Canada, the results were completely different. The PTs decided in September to add emicizumab to the CVS formulary for those with less than 1% of factor VIII. So that represents, in effect, 95% of severe cases. And the transition started just last month, and we're transitioning 20 to 30 new patients per month out of the 800 who are eligible. So why does Canada take so long? This is my reading of things. There's a perception that hemophilia has been solved, which is wrong. A perception that there's a high budget impact, which may or may not be right, was based on poor information. I think there's general issues that probably affect most new drugs. There's built-in delays in adopting innovative technologies. I really believe that there's a methodological bias in reviewing drugs for rare diseases. They look only at the reports from the manufacturer. They made no use of the wide real-world evidence that had accumulated over several years of use. And I think there's so the problem with in terms of pricing, because a lot of these cost-benefit analyses are based on what I think is garbage in, garbage out. The information on even on the competitor may be flawed. They're not looking at real prices. And there's, I think, a discounting of the patient perspective. So with all of that, we've had successes and we've had failures. I guess I can still give some advice. I think it's really, really important that patients and physicians have a very clear position and a unified voice. And we had that in this case, and that certainly has been extremely helpful. We were able to involve our members and get them to express their voice. We gathered data on lived experience, and that's, I think, something that clinicians have more trouble doing, but certainly patient organizations can do that with modern day tools. And we went beyond just presenting lived experience. We also presented what we thought was the most relevant research over and above the studies that led to NOC. And something which is really important, and Durhan taught me this way back in 1991 when recombinant factor VIII was approved: follow the money. Know what the costs are. Don't believe what we're told by health officials. Combine data and anecdote. Yes, we need the stories, but we also need solid data to back them up. And I guess most important of all, don't give up. And all of our reports, whether it's our reports or the actual HTA reports, letters, webinars, our Q&As, sample letters to politicians, communiques, they're all available in French and English on our website. And that's where I'll stop.
That was amazing, David. You've taken us back into a case study that you probably, given the facts of the case, never really expected to have to work through, because, you know, on the surface, it seemed like this should have gone through the system without the bumps that it hit. So I don't, although you unpacked a lot of those bumps, you're also lamenting the fact that a lot of this was not really transparent. So you don't know why you had to generate 10,000 letters to be able to deal with this challenge, if I'm not mistaken. And then I want to invite, while you're thinking about that, Taya and Maureen, Christian, Peter, Jessica, Glenn, and of course Durhan's back too to help kick us into a discussion. Again, everyone on the chat, please keep it going. It's amazing. We've got almost 100 delegates still on the line and participating. And we felt so much love from the last session that we had, the platform. And let's take some of that goodwill and get her done attitude into this one too, to help unpack some of those bumps that you identified. So yeah, I mean, waiting for people to turn their cameras on, was this a surprise to you, David, that like you've been through a few, this is not your first rodeo of challenges in terms of access to medicines. Were you surprised, given the facts of this case specifically, that you had to deal with this one?
Well, we were, I think, surprised at getting the negative HTA decisions or recommendations, given what we thought was a pretty clear cut and dried case in terms of efficacy. We expected the long drawn out review, because everything is sequential. First there was the NOC, and then there was a decision on which pathway it goes, and then there was CADIF, and then there was CBS, and so we knew that was going to take forever. It took 30 months, and everybody followed their schedule. Nobody delayed. It was designed to take 30 months.
Okay, well that's so you weren't surprised about the delay. The only surprise was that the HTA with that lower than the lowest cost alternative. I think that's the one specific thing you're pointing to.
It looks to me like CADIF puts that in almost every review that I've seen. So yeah. I guess shouldn't be surprised. I think the clinicians were really surprised, given their knowledge of the different therapies, and they were really surprised at the methodology and the limited methodology that certainly Ines and perhaps to a lesser extent CADIF used, and their very narrow focus on the the studies that led to NOC, and not on a lot of other information.
So let's build from there and open it up to the panel. And remember that we're going to talk about meaningful representative patient engagement throughout that system to deal with those bumps. And any reaction from the very learned and experienced panel we've got today. Don't be shy, and I know none of you are. Who wants to start?
Is Maureen on yet? If she's not on, maybe if she is on, I'd love to have her kind of jump in, but I know she was going to be somewhat delayed. She said to getting to it, so she may not.
She's going to be on at 1 o'clock, Durhan.
We got Maureen in 5 minutes.
We got 5 minutes, so I think this would be a great opportunity to kind of come back to, I think, really circling on the patient perspective. But can I just respond a little bit to David to begin with? David and I do go way back. I've forgotten how long we went back, and I appreciate what David said as well, because it was that first advocacy with the recombinant, where the first response we got back was, "Oh, it's too expensive," and we said, "Well, how expensive is this?" Well, we can't tell you. We said, "Well, that kind of sucks," And then we did our own research to really demonstrate, was it not going to be expensive, but it has many other benefits to it. So I think we learned early on that you do have to have the patient voice, you do have to do all the advocacy, but you better have good solid data. And I think that's something that has been important here. I would kind of be interested, given the long history of it, and before Maureen comes on, I'm just want to kick it over to Peter Brenders and ask him, because Peter, you've been involved for a long time with Fabry's disease, and we've had some very interesting, varying kinds of experience as well. How would you respond to what David says from a totally different perspective? But really, do you feel that, a lot of what we learned with Fabry's really can add to or substantiate what David said? And I'm really interested in what he said at the end, and that is, we don't want it to go to tender. What's the wrong with going to tender?
So let me let me answer the first part of the question on before you throw the hand grenade of tenders out there, Durhan. So thank you for that. But you know, David's story it's a fascinating one too. Yes, there are flashbacks to Fabry, and frankly, there's flashbacks to pretty much every other product that's gone in there. Isn't it fascinating that it takes 30 months to come to an answer, and that you're still pushing? You know, the quote I've often used there is an old quote attributed to a bishop of Sheffield a century ago, is that governments are like wheelbarrows, useful, but have to be pushed. And then that's, you know, kind of the world we're living in here with healthcare, is like, we're always pushing. And like, why? You know, I was a bureaucrat 25 years ago. And one thing I learned early on is life is really easy when you treat people. When you don't, you know, you get called into the minister's office and told to get rid of that family in that tent sitting on the front lawn at Queen's Park, make it go away. And yet that's where our healthcare is still at today, is we're still pushing and pushing. And so why is that? And I thought it was an interesting point you said there is the voice of the patient heard? So I'm thinking back a year ago, I was the CEO of the New Brunswick Health Research Foundation, and I did a panel on patient-oriented research. It's the hot thing. Like CIHR for a decade and a half has been putting a lot of money in terms of engaging the patient. And yet when I talk to a lot of the researchers and groups out there, patient engagement is token. Still is. And it's fascinating when you think back to, there was a patient, Valerie Billingham, back in '98 at a Salzburg Health Policy Conference about talking the voice of the patient. She came up with the seminal line, "Nothing about me without me." And yet today we still don't do that. So what is it about, not just the system? Well, maybe it is the system, or maybe it's the care. Is like, why don't we engage patients? Why don't we listen to them? Are we too paternalistic as a system that's out there? It's like, we don't want to hear their voices because, you know, what do they know? How do we change that view such that when we hear, that we actually listen, and do our processes actually listen to patients? Like, we all make submissions. You did your 10,000 letters. Who read those? Anyone? Like, at the end, it came down to, you still had to do the media strategy. And that's what we did in Fabry. That's what we faced with Durhan. You were the leader on that one. You remember the scarves on Parliament Hill. In the absence of that engagement, Fabry patients would still be dying at 40 years of age today, right? You had to change the system. And so, you know, we're 20 years since then, and we're still the same. I wonder why.
Thanks, Peter. Can anyone answer Peter's question? Maybe Glenn. I mean, you've been at this on several sides of the issue, including the public sector, at the provincial level. You know, why? Over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you. So, you know, and it's interesting with Durhan, Peter and I were kind of three corners of the unholy trinity of the Fabry negotiations nearly 20 years ago. But I truly think it's there's a caution in government, and it's often disguised as we need to assure taxpayers that we're using our resources as for the best possible outcomes. And so there's a mistrust of the Health Canada licensing process that's actually built into the system, and largely based on the fact that it's typically a clinical trial, and it's typically has a placebo, so it doesn't have a comparator. So we built a whole set of processes to kind of wash the same evidence in multiple ways across various rocks to try to somehow arrive at an efficacy to effectiveness conversion without actually having it in the system being used. And I'll come back to the private payer side in a moment, where it's a slightly different journey, at least historically it has been. And then at that point, we satisfied ourselves that it does something clinically in the real world without it actually being in the real world from a public payer. Then we want to sit down and negotiate it. So all these processes are, in fact, at 30 months is, you know, that David outlined. For many products, that's very fast. Quite honestly, particularly in the rare disease space. So it really is designed. All the systems are designed fundamentally to say no until you've overwhelmed the system, and then once it's through, it kind of gets ignored. because we're now waiting for the next one. So what we don't do is life cycle manage the decisions. We don't necessarily life cycle the treatment journey once these products become available. So I round back to the previous panel discussion before this one, where we talked about all the input data and all the flow and monitoring it through. We've done those things from time to time in various therapeutic areas. One that comes to mind is AMD, certainly in the Alberta context with the RAPID program, where we actually fund and pay the clinicians to maintain all the safety registries that go in on the ongoing care for those patients. And it's factored right into the program itself. And that's an exceptional situation. But what we wanted to do was ensure if we're making products available, including in that case, an off-label product, that safety was paramount. So I think we managed safety as our preeminent excuse, but truthfully, it really is more on the risk aversion of buying something on behalf of a patient or reimbursing something on behalf of a patient that we can't get out of if we don't like it later. And so I think really that is the conundrum that we're in. And where I've been concerned increasingly in rare disease is they're not so rare in the totality as we've talked about. But what we really are is at this early intersect point where precision diagnostics are now starting to meet precision treatments. And I think we got to reframe the language because what we are continuing to do is put everything through a traditional drug reimbursement lens. And more that is less applicable. When we deal with gene therapies, we're dealing with CAR-Ts, we're dealing with potentially some version of CRISPR manipulations, et cetera. We're still going to try and push these things through what is ostensibly built as a 1990s, keeping in mind that CODA, the precursor for CADAs, was in the early 90s, 1994, when it was first established. And we're still doing a version of that now. I mean, yes, it's modified. Yes, they've expanded what they do, but we've not really figured out fully how to put patients into the discussion because we don't trust patients because patients will always want everything, no matter how good or how bad it might be. And, the faint hope clause, if you will. And I think the patient communities with people like Durhane and many of her colleagues in the rare disease space, and in fact, in mainstream disease space as well, are much more informed, much more educated now, and much more realistic about what you do and don't do in this space. And I'm not sure that has been fully bridged going forward. So it's a very long-winded way of saying it is a whole series of systemic biases that were built on a premise that makes sense, perhaps, with large-scale treatments for large-scale diseases to do modest improvements. And we have continued to kind of build on it rather than take a look at what do we need to do fundamentally that's different. And I like what the Scots are starting to do with ultra-rare disease medications. I see the French are taking a look at it now, where what they're wanting to do is get the product into patients sooner and then get the final evidentiary pieces in the real world gathered over time and come back and do a reassessment, as opposed to hold the patients in abeyance for years and years and years till either you're satisfied on the evidence or you're overwhelmed by the political pressure. And I think we have to break down and be more mature about this.
Thanks, Glenn.
Can I jump in for a second there, Bill? I mean, because I do want to take it over. I see that Maureen is here. Maureen, we've been holding our breath for you to come in. So you do not know what the anticipation is. So do not fail us here, but never mind that. No, seriously though, I just want to respond just briefly to what Glenn said. We had such a great opportunity. I had forgotten, quite frankly, that Glenn, that you, Peter, and I were three corners of the table when Fabrice came up. And but I want to ask a slightly different question. I love how really frank you were about some of the challenges that are still tied to the traditional models that we're using in order not, as David said, not only to assess the product. I mean, hemophilia got away with it for a long time because it never went through HTA. And hemophilia got away with it a long time because there was no really strict kind of a budget that said, okay, if I spend dollar X, I'm going to have to take it away from dollar Y. And there wasn't necessarily that kind of thinking. There was that there are products coming, and yes, we have to be realistic at it, but it wasn't, I think, what we see in the HTA. And I really want to know, and maybe not to bring Lori back in right away, but I really want to ask that question. How much does cost utility still have to do with it? Because when we learned HTA at the very beginning, and I learned it just on the streets, you know, it was the idea that not only are you going to compare it to the past product and how much added benefit for the added dollar, the question is, what else can I buy for that dollar? And I think, David, you and I were around when we had people that said, why should I treat one rare disease patient when I can treat 700 diabetic patients for the same dollar? And we're kind of going like, oh, yeah, but do the diabetic patients really need it as much as do the rare disease patient? Because you know what?
Yeah. Well, and what they told me though is like, oh, if you don't need it, you don't need it, right? So we hadn't been using because we didn't need it, and now we need it again. And hopefully we'll get back to the spot where we don't need it. Yeah.
Sorry, I just I managed to find who jumped in there with the microphone. Apologies for that.
It's okay. So I just want to put it back out there, you know, and I really appreciate your last comment. And again, not to move entirely in that direction, but it's something many of us have really been, you know, grating on. And that is, do we need that fundamental paradigm shift in terms of what we're doing with HTA? I myself never thought HTA really gave us good scientific advice anyway. And I think HTA even admitted itself, it was a quasi-scientific method. And I remember way back, Peter, you'll remember one of the early seminars we had with Norm Daniels, who basically said, I don't know how this methodology works. The only thing that saves it is transparency. You've got to be able to show clearly what your methods are and be able to also, he said way back in those early days, you got to bring the patient and the public into the model. So, but, you know, so are we ready for a paradigm shift? Is that paradigm shift, you know, obviously going to be driven a lot by these new therapies, precision therapies, and curable, so-called close to being curable kinds of therapies? Because what we know is that we're force feeding these therapies into that old funnel. And what we get out on the other side is not necessarily the most useful in terms of these new therapies. Even as you're saying, you know, is the whole idea of a managed access scheme. And we make it available, we collect the information, and then we'll reassess it. If we do not have a different model for reassessing, we may end up where ICWIC does, where Germany does, you know, where Netherlands has been. And we look at the new data using our old tools, and we say, gosh, it's not cost effective. You know, well, okay, but are you using the right tools? You know, it's like, again, that, you know, new wine in old bottles, you know, you kind of end up with the same old wine then. And you know, and I'm really excited to see, you know, can we, with this new rare disease drug system, where we're looking at these rare and ultra rare and these very innovative therapies, is it time to think about a new model? And I'm especially excited by the fact that CADIS is here, because we're not saying taking away from CADIS. We're really saying CADIS and INES, can we work with it? Is there an opportunity to do this differently?
So is that a shout out to Maureen to jump in here, who, Maureen, at the Committee to Evaluate Drugs in Ontario, you were the patient voice on some of these therapies that were coming through. We've already talked about, you know, the decades-long experience have, you know, not too much has changed based on David's case study. What are your thoughts about how to get the patient more at the center and you know, weigh in here? And then I think we should go out to the private sector, because 2/3 of all Canadians get access to medicines through their private drug insurance plans, which are layered and backstopped by the catastrophic drug programs in the public system as well. But we have that overlap layer of insurance. And then a lot of these therapies are actually coming from the labs at Alexion and Novartis. And not even there, you're actually taking the labs in the hospitals now with some of the gene editing tools. So it's a really joint venture with the public sector. Maybe back to Durhan's question about the tools, what's coming out of the fact of these new therapies that are coming forward that will allow the payers to actually get their heads around it, and for patients to really feel like they're part of the process. So I know I just threw out a bunch of stuff, but I wanted to set us up for our next speaker. So Maureen, to you, and then over to you, Jessica, and then to Taya and Christian.
So apologies to everyone for coming in late. When you advocate to embed patients into organizations, you actually have to attend meetings. So because now you're embedded and you're at the management level and they invite you to all these meetings. So that's where I was. So if anything, that I started with the Committee to Evaluate Drugs in 2014. I'm still on it, but we don't do quite the same thing anymore. We're kind of a CED light version. If anything that's taught me is that we need a rare disease agency or whatever you want to call it at the national level. So it doesn't work for rare diseases to be doing it provincially. And that's the biggest lesson that I've learned. Lots of frustration watching rare disease drugs come through with lots of issues to evaluating them. I think that there's what we need for whatever they call this agencies are what we need to enable the patients to be truly embedded at all levels of the agency. And I apologize if you've already said this, but the first one is the training, and that's a no-brainer because CORD has proven over and over again that they are the organization to lead this training. So last year, I was part of the faculty for this 10-week course that we did, and I attended every one of them, and I was in the breakout rooms, and to see the evolution of the patients who attended from the beginning to the end was really important. So they need to budget for that training. They need to provide resources for it. CORD can't be doing this for free all the time. So that's really important. And what that does is it gives you patients with a broader perspective. And it also gives you patients that have that disease perspective that's so important when you get to specific drugs. But you need both to make the system work. The second one that is more difficult to do is patient group involvement. So when it comes time for submissions, like you would be making to this agency, don't make patient groups rely on unrestricted grants from pharma, because that's a way to invalidate their input. So the input comes in, oh, they're a mouthpiece for pharma. So you need to budget for that. You need to give them money to go out and survey their members, so that when it's over, it's not stamped with a big red X on it. So that's really important. Though I think those two factors, and what I'm saying is nothing new. It's being done all over the world. So a couple of years ago, I attended a CIOMS meeting, sorry for the acronym, Medical Sciences Organization over the world, where all of these people representing regulatory agencies from all over the world, and it's being done. We've got best practices from all over. So, I wouldn't be here today talking to you if I hadn't benefited from 9 years of CORD training. So you want people to be meaningfully engaged. You want them in the governance. You want them all through that agency. It's really important that that be put into place, and that's really going to help that HTA process, where it's been really tough for patient groups to get their submissions in and have them on the same level as all of the other submissions that are coming through. I know I didn't answer all your questions, Bill, but I don't want to keep going. So unless there's something else specific, that was kind of what I wanted to say.
No, those are the breadcrumbs on the road that we need to get to the gingerbread house. I'm ruining another analogy. Sorry about that. Jessica, what are the breadcrumbs that you can lay out from the private payer perspective, and what have you heard?
I love the breadcrumb analogy, and I also love your attempt at my last name in my introduction. You did a fine job. Most people struggle, so well done. We have definitely been really engaged in this conversation for some time, and particularly over the last couple of years, as the government's commitment around a strategy and the spending of the $500 million has sort of become much more present in the discourse. And one of the most important things for us, there's really two sort of key layers that we think are really important. I think the first is the patient experience. And as we've been looking at this, from a private insurance perspective, from an employer perspective, really thinking about, how to center this for the patient, and whatever this strategy sort of looks like at the end of the day, we need to make it simpler. It needs to be accessible for patients. So that's been really important for us as we're sort of thinking about, how we view this, and the importance sort of private payers, in the space as we start looking at, the contributions contributions that employers make around paying for some of these drugs over time, and we look at that in comparison to the money that's available, that's sort of been identified by government. There's a really, I think, important marrying of all these different payers, provincial governments, federal government, and our industry as well, to really keep this going and to support patients. So I think those have been really foundational for us. And so as we've been, working with the federal government over the last year in particular, I think we've really started to drill down much more, towards the end of the summer around to the point about, how do we make this work, right? We're talking about all these different players in the space, and that can get tricky, right? So, how would that work? And so we've really thought a lot about the importance of sort of a national formulary and really looking at, a base level, if you will, of drugs that, sorry, my phone just won't stop. A base layer of drugs that we could possibly include, across the country, again, around consistency for patients and increased access. We think that's really important, and that it's specific to the rare disease space. And as I sort of alluded to at the beginning, the governance we think is really important. And I know people on this panel have talked a lot about that. Particularly, there's a lot of different sort of agencies and bodies out there right now sort of working in the space. And so how important and critical it really is to kind of bring that all together, so that we're all talking to each other. All these different groups are sharing data and information in a more cohesive way. We think that that's really important and sort of foundational to this strategy. And then I think when we think about, all these different payers, how in the world do you structure this, right? How do you, what does a funding mechanism look like? And how do you reasonably share costs, across all of these different payers? Again, in a way that ultimately, creates greater access and treatment for patients. And so looking at sort of what that reasonable sort of cost sharing arrangement would look like, with governments, with private insurance, and with the federal government, and sort of where do different payers kick in? We think that that's really important, and kind of honing in on what that looks like. It may be kind of technical, but it is the old rubber hitting the road, if you will. And then, the funding mechanism itself, sort of once you know what that threshold is, how are we making it so that, if I'm a patient, I don't see all of that happening behind the scenes, but rather, I go to the place where I receive my treatment, hospital, pharmacy, whatever it is, and it's paid for, right? I don't have to go here and go there and this card here and that card there. It's all happening behind the scenes. And so we've talked a lot about what we kind of call like a reinsurance model, where essentially all of that is happening behind the scenes. The infrastructure's there, we build on it, we amplify it, but at the end of the day, we're all talking behind the scenes and figuring that, that out, and patients are just really getting access to what they need and not having to worry, about that piece. So those are some of the pieces that are really important to us. And if you will, the breadcrumbs for the gingerbread house that we've been trying to talk more and more about and sort of get people thinking in that space, particularly if the strategy is going to roll out sometime next year, which I think is sort of what we're hearing from government. These details are really important for us to start working out.
That's a great update in terms of where you are on and your hopes are for next year.
Mm-hmm.
Let's hear from Novartis and Alexion, because if we're taking the road analogy a little bit further, you're putting the cars on the road that have to make it to the other side. So what have you heard, and how can you make sure that patients are maybe even in the driver's seat in some cases?
Yeah, so I'll kick it off, Bill. I think as a pharma company, when we bring these novel treatments to market and to Canada, it comes with certain responsibilities, right? And I would say there's two big ones, in my opinion. And the first one, I think it was Maureen that alluded to it. How do we make sure all patients have access to this, right? So I'm referring to the equitable access piece. And we saw a lot of, with Zolgensma, this is all public, crowdfunding campaigns, some families who have access to, funds or ways to be more vocal and to have their cases known. Not all patients and not all families have access to these things. So how can we work on, tools where patients are screened, treated early enough, and have better outcomes, because better outcomes benefits everyone, including the healthcare system. For SMA, specifically, we worked very closely with some key stakeholders to integrate newborn screening into the provinces. So whether you're born in British Columbia or in Quebec, all babies should be screened so that, all eligible, and I'm not suggesting that Zolgensma is the only treatment, but that at least there's an assessment made very early on about what treatments they have access to. The second bucket for me is these are expensive medications. And yes, we have our key messages to justify the pricing, and they are valid. It's not, there are reasons why the medications are priced where they're priced. But that being said, we also have a responsibility to sit down with payers and say, okay, how can we work together to make sure this medicine or this treatment is integrated into the healthcare system in the most cost-efficient way? And in order for that conversation to happen, there's a huge mindset shift, right? And we're starting to see it occur at some level, but can we just move away from us versus them? And let's redirect the energy. And I love the analogy of pushing the wheelbarrow or the wheel cart, because that's exactly how we feel every step of the way. I can only imagine what it's like for patients and their families. And sit down and refocus and say, how do we get access early? How do we bump ourselves from, my team is fed up of hearing me say it, but I saw a statistic, 19 out of 20 OECD countries in terms of access. That's horrific, right? So how do we work together to bump that number up? And how do we do it in a responsible, cost-effective way? I'll stop there because I'm sure Christian also has things to say, but those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Fantastic. Yeah, pleasure to meet you all. First of all, just want to introduce myself quickly because I'm basically very new to the country. I'm Christian Hansen. I'm the general manager of Alexion Pharma Canada, and this is my first court conference as I moved here just 5 weeks ago, and I've already had the opportunity to meet with a few patient representatives and also patients living with rare disease. And it's really a privilege to be here at this time and leading the Canadian organization, because it's really a pivotal time where we really stand at this precipice of launching a Made in Canada rare disease strategy for Canadians. And I really just learned about all that in the last couple of weeks. And, with partners in government, we're really willing to address the unmet needs of these unique patient population. And I also want to start by thanking Court and thanking Durhan for being a formidable leader and building such a strong organization. I had the pleasure, to meet her a couple of weeks ago, and I'm really inspired by the work that Court is doing. And really, there's this milestone of being at the launch of the rare disease strategy in Canada. And again, being new to the country, it's something really remarkable and potentially transformative for patient. And I'm not going to repeat what Thea said in terms of access. The first thing I learned about Canada, it's all about access. We have to make sure there's access to our innovative and transformative therapies. And one thing I can maybe add is that as an organization, we are not only focused on serving the needs of patients and their families with rare disease, but as a company, we've begun this transformative journey back in 2019, moving more from a product to a patient-focused organization, and also, continue to evolve and develop the organization and change the organizational design. Look at do we have the right people, resources, and really realize that, this is a priority of putting patients first, and not just talking about it, but really doing it and really bringing people on board that are focused entirely on understanding the patient journey, from discovery, development, and commercialization and access of these life-changing medicines. So we really, try to make this happen, and it's a long journey, and to get as close as possible to all the different decision makers, and to really partner also, right? And I joined the last couple of minutes of the previous discussion. It's not one against the other. It's also about partnering. And maybe one more thought, having moved from Europe, just recently, that at the European level, the European Medicines Agency, they appoint patient representatives key decision-making committees, right? And such as the Committee on Orphan Medicinal Products. And there's also other countries and HTA organizations that are very open, such as the Scottish Medicines Consortium or NICE in the UK or in the Netherlands, where there's a great examples of how the patient's perspective is built into, you know, everything they're doing. So yeah, so that's kind of my maybe more like first reflections, and I see great opportunity for patients, and I really yeah, I'm just impressed by the work that CORD is actually doing. It's a pleasure to be here and meet you all.
Christian, you also brought up something that came out yesterday really strongly, which was Canada does not have a clinician research patient constituted committee for rare, where there is a national committee that can be an advisory group for both policy issues and some of these tough nuts. You know, and so thank you for reminding of that. Was one of the takeaways from yesterday, that you're reminding us that other jurisdictions have had those for a long time. Now, Durhan, I'm keeping an eye on the time. Speaking of time, can we loop back maybe to David to just ask David, you know, what have you heard from the rest of the panel? One thing I'll pick up from what Jessica said was that the private payers and others want to make this as seamless as possible for individual patients, but a lot of that work is going to be happening behind the scenes. Who else is behind the scenes? Is David there? Is Thea there? Is Durhan there? And then is it easy for the patients? Because otherwise, you know, a lot of the transparency and those bumps that you spoke about earlier, we just won't know about them. So David, do you want to just reflect on what you've heard now, and as a way to sort of close out this session? I know we're bumping up a little bit on some time here.
Well, a couple of comments. I guess one is that, you know, from the outside, from the patient perspective, it's an incredibly complex system in Canada. And I've, you know, heard presentations from Scotland and from NICE, and they seem to have simplified things a bit. Whereas, you know, when we think about HTAs and PMPRB and all these other organizations, like, it's a huge bureaucracy. And it's somewhat opaque and daunting for patients. The other comment I have is, you know, I think Kadith and Ines have done a really good job in including patients in the process, and you know, and I think we felt you know, respected and included and helped. But when it came down to the decision, it was done by people who had a particular mindset, a scientific mindset based on clinical trial data. And the patient perspective was just completely lost, and there was no opportunity to participate at that level. Perhaps they read a report. I hope they read the report, but there was no, you know, and the topic for the presentation was meaningful patient participation. I don't think the meeting got through.
Well, and that was why it was great to start with that case study. We've got about 15 minutes for this conversation, so feel free to jump in, put your hand up. I think Peter's got his virtual and regular hand up. Go ahead, and I love your shirt, Peter. I'm sure everyone was waiting to say that, but there you go.
Picked it out just for this one today. Got it right there. So many jokes. No, thanks for everyone. Thanks for Duran for this panel on that one. And I want to come back to something that Glenn said I thought was incredibly insightful. And it's a reality check for all of us on that one, because Glenn was saying too, you know, the mindset of government may have been at the time about risk, right? Didn't really want to take on the risk, didn't believe in Health Canada. We know better than Health Canada. How could they possibly approve this drug? Yada, yada, all that sort of stuff. But part of it is, I think there's a bit of disingenuity involved in this one. And my question is, do they really care about patients? Do they, you know, they give lip service, but do they care? And so what I was reflecting on was yesterday's Ontario Auditor General report. And so it reflected, it said that, you know, the Ford government spent $210 million to ineligible recipients and wasn't going to recover that. They floated out there. And if I think about Ford's comment when asked about it, he basically said, look, we had to move quickly to support businesses. So when have we ever heard a government say, hey, we got to move quickly to support patients? do you think maybe that they, as to quote that 2009 movie, they just might not be that into you? Right? Do they give us a little bit of lip service? Patients are important to us. Yeah, but philosophically, you're not. Because, you know, I reflect on it, as I said, my bureaucrat days, 2.5 decades or so ago. Actually, when you cared for patients and you did stuff out there, like, what's the risk? Honestly, what's the risk? The risk that a doctor that decided a treatment for a patient that could help that patient was written. So what's the complaint going to be? Who's going to complain about that? Anyone in public out there? How dare you look after those cancer patients? How dare you look after those rare disease patients? I wonder if we need to actually get some clarity in terms of how much does our system really care?
Yeah. And that's, I mean, you ended your opening with the why that we ended up going back to Glenn on and with. And this is, you know what the answer is because you've heard it from HTA experts too, that look at these as from a cost, opportunity cost perspective. They often point to the unknown patient, the people who won't get access because we're giving access to this one. I mean, Maureen, you've been around those tables and those deliberations. I mean, do these groups care? And then how are things rolled up and out in a way that maybe, I don't know, responds to what Peter just put out there? Is that fair to actually ask you to comment on?
Well, I can say that I think the individual people care. I've never, heard any comments that were, not kind towards people looking for drugs, but I think the system then has a way of operating that kind of, goes to cost effectiveness. But, as far, 7 years I've been in the discussions, and they're not uncaring people. I don't think the system is set up to be uncaring, but the way the system operates and the fact that if you start with the premise that any kind of input from the patients is tainted, you're not going to go very far. Like you need to set the reset button and say that this is all very valued and this lived experience is really important. They say that, but that's where some of it goes off the rails sometimes. So you often hear about conflict of interest. Conflict of interest, but everyone has conflicts of interest, and they've set up the system so that we don't have an option. Where do they think these small, grassroots groups are going to get the money to do their own work and to do a good job of it? I mean, I've probably read about 200 patient submissions by now, and some of them are really kind of sad. And I know that's because they didn't have the budget. They're small groups, and they just did the best that they could. And it definitely has an impact, like a good submission is. So I think it's the way the system's set up. I would never say that the people who I work with are uncaring, but I think the system needs a rehaul. And I think the whole idea of doing rare disease drugs provincially is a big problem, because you need experts from, often even international to come in. You can't rely on just who's in that province, because often those experts are conflicted. Of course they're conflicted. There's only a few doctors working on that. They're going to be involved in the trial. So it's like it's a system that's just not set up to work. And I think that's what we've been saying all along. And I think now there's an appetite to hear that. And this is really our big chance. So
yeah. Are we overanalyzing sometimes? Maybe Christian, you can comment on this from coming from Europe very recently. My understanding is that several jurisdictions there, if there's a budget impact below 50 million euros, it doesn't go through an HTA. UK NICE doesn't actually review everything. Why does Canada have to look at every molecule or every therapy coming forward and analyze it beside everything else? That 30-month odyssey. Are there some other learnings that we can bring from Europe potentially?
Yeah, I think there's not a simple answer to that question, because it's very, very different, right? Depending on where you go and what country you're in. So I would just say, based on what I've seen in Canada, that the overall system is obviously complex, and there is no easy solution to that. And I think what you were discussing here also earlier today is is there a point where it needs a more fundamental change, right? And instead of many small changes. And I really believe, as I mentioned before, right, getting the patients involved in the processes as early as possible. And that is maybe the learning, right, from NICE, from Scotland and the Netherlands and other countries. That is maybe an opportunity where, Canada, can also look at those systems and see what we can learn from them. But there's no simple comparison, and just bring over the great single idea from Europe, and Durhan can probably also comment on that based on what she's seen there. So not an easy one.
Well, and we have to thank Lori from CADIF from continuing to light up the chat panel. There's some interesting things that have happened at CADIF, and maybe I'll throw this out for the folks who have been involved in the cancer review world. The Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review process was built by patients, clinicians, the private sector, and the drug agencies. Oh, Durhan, you're going to jump in here, but the point is,
I'm going to totally disagree. I'm going to totally disagree.
Good. This
and
is.
I was involved in JODA way back when, right before it became PCODA, and then it was PCODA, and then PCODA was brought into CADIF. I mean, frankly, at the end of the day, the patients were always on the outside. The system was never designed. It was designed for a specific purpose. We have a drug, we have a better drug. Does this better drug work better than the old drug? Oh, we're going to bring in a better drug and it's going to cost more. So should we be dumping something else out of the system? That was always it. It was always an economic decision. And, somebody asked the question, does qualities work? Well, qualities kind of work, but we reduce the quality, the person's quality of life to a cost per quality. I mean, that's what equality did for us. Is that really what we meant to do? And I think we've continued to use this model now. And as we said, force feed it, and Lori has been bringing in, and quite to her credit, some really the resources, the new definition of HTA, but it's all variations of the same thing. And I'm going to, maybe take what Maureen said just a step further. We fought for so hard. I sat on that Patient Citizen Involvement Group International. We fought to get to the table. We fought to have our voices heard. I worked with Taiwan when they were bringing patient advocates in, and everybody was desperate to be at the table. And when you got to the table, as Maureen says, everybody was like you, at least if you were reasonably well-behaved. If you were not well-behaved, they were not so nice to you. And, I've been at tables where, in fact, some of the poor patients were actually denigrated for being, unable to do, for not being able to speak up. So I think the challenge is it's very seductive. You get into the table, you are kind of coached at the table, and you're also kind of molded into that group think. And so after a while, you forget, what did I really go in there for? And what was I trying to do? And I'm not saying it's anything deliberate on anybody's part. It's just the way the psychology works, right? So I'm asking the question again. Is it fundamentally the time to pull back, rethink what this is all about, look at the new therapies that we got that absolutely could provide such amazing, life-changing benefits to the patients, and ask ourselves the question, if I were to design a system that said, I want to get patients to the best therapy as soon as possible, with the caveat that we'll continue to collect the information to see if it really works at the individual level and at the high level, given the methodology that we can now do it. I mean, Glenn, you and I agreed that in 2006, when we brought in that rare disease drug strategy, if we had implemented, it would have been a joke, because we didn't have the technology to do it. We didn't have the mindset to be able to do it. We would have had dismal failures on our hand, and we were all ended up saying, see, it doesn't work. And so I'm happy that we are now doing it where we could have that. So and I guess I don't want to leave with this, but I see this rare disease drug strategy and the minds that we've got around the table. And I am so delighted with Jessica, and I won't even try your last name. I know you told me once to try to say it, but I give up on it. Never mind, But, I think we need to all be at that table and ask ourselves again, do we have an opportunity to do this differently? And can we start with that fundamental premise? Can we get really important therapies to patients as soon as possible? And sustainability, I say. I don't want to define it as what a bureaucrat might with, and that is, can I meet my budget? No, you can't meet your budget. You're never going to meet your budget. And your budget's been expanding every year. I remember one of the ministers said to me, Gerhan, I love your drug, but it's going to break my budget and I can't keep doing it. And I said, well, I got an answer for you. Come and meet me at the beginning of the year. I'll tell you all the drugs we're going to bring in. We will cost estimate what it's cost. You just go in and ask for a bigger budget. We can help you meet your budget. Just get the right budget. I think these therapies are coming in, they're life-saving, they're going to cost more, they're going to offset other costs. And even if they don't, they're going to benefit society. So I just think we want to rethink it. And I don't want to make it too much of just that kind of a plea, but I think it's our fundamental challenge. If we go into this and we use the same old seeds and we use the same old hands and we do the same old things, we're going to end up with the same old outcomes. And this is our chance to really fundamentally be different.
Revolutionary. Thank you, Derhan. And Canada will be a world leader, which you always remind me, like we have this, we're on the edge of really leapfrogging, where we were way behind. Can we do something different here? Glenn, why don't you jump in, try to keep it brief because we have till 1:45. I want to bring it back to Derhan and in fact to all the delegates here to really build on the amazing things that we've done over the last day and a half. So
sure. I'll be quick on Bill. It's a bit of a stump I have, but I'll be quick on it. And that is that I even heard it today in the various presentations of the role of the patient and the role of I would actually say the role of the citizen, and that stop calling patients stakeholders. They're shareholders. There's one payer in the entire healthcare system. Doesn't matter if it's private pay for the reimbursement or public pay. Private pay just means it's an offset to their income. Public pay, it's an offset to their taxes. It's a shareholder, and what we expect is shareholders to be heard. What we expect is shareholders to understand value, and what we expect is shareholders to receive the benefits of that value. And we've totally got to change our orientation in this. We are set up as an acrimonious or challenge system as opposed to a harmonious and solution system. And I think that's where we've got to reorient this. And maybe it can be born out of a dedicated pan-Canadian rare disease agency to test drive it, because that is the challenge we have throughout the entire system in Canada today.
That was excellent, Glenn, and briefer than I expected. So thank you. My turn to buy you a drink sometime next time I see you in Ottawa. Okay, it's been too long. Okay, last thoughts and words on this before we bring it back to Derhan to help close out this session at 1:45. Anyone else want to help bring this panel home? David,
I want Maureen to come back in.
Okay. Maureen, Derhan wants you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I really do believe that we are at a tipping point. And I agree with Derhan that it's time for a reset. Like, I think we need to look at what we've been doing and where we can go forward. I mean, patient engagement and patient sitting at the table is nothing new now. It's expected. Like, it's, when I started 12 years ago with, 12, well, I've been over 20 years in patient engagement, but it was a big deal if they brought you in. But now it's expected, and we need to go in with that idea. Like, we're not asking them; we should be telling them that this is how it works, and we need to be embedded in whatever system that they come up with. And we need the people with the broader perspective of the rare disease community. Those are the people that have been through the training and understand all of the issues. And then we need the people with the disease-specific experience, because that's what we need when we're looking at those drugs. I think a combination of the two is going to be very powerful, but it's not, I think the time for waiting for your invitation to come in the mail has passed. Like, I think now it should be a given. You're setting up the system. Okay, this is where we think we should be, and let's work with them. And our community is set up for that. Like we're not starting from zero. We are set up for that. So I'll leave that as my final thoughts. But it's a very, very exciting time. And I've thought before there were exciting times where things are going to happen, and they didn't happen. But this time, I think well, we've got the money promised, so show me the money, right? I'll stop there.
It's almost like you flipped it. You're inviting us, right? You're inviting government. You're not waiting for your invitation on the phone or the mail. That's great. David, last word to you.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, I agree with Durhan. The whole thing, I think, needs to be rethought. I've been doing this for many, many, many years, and it's not getting easier. It's getting harder as we go. Each new effort has been much more complicated and more difficult to achieve results. And now I look at all the exciting therapies that are coming, and I go, I don't know how many times I can do this, and especially if it gets harder and harder. So I agree with the revolution idea.
Dave, that makes me think of the Lethal Weapon movies when Danny Glover used to say, and I'm getting too old for this, you know what? And I've been around not as long as you have, but let's keep the energy from this panel and this conference going. So Durhan, I don't know if you want to thank the panel with me, and then we can close out the conference. We've got 15 minutes left, 100 people on the line. So go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know that I can close out this panel. I have become far too much sucked into the panel. So thank God you were still there to kind of add some balance to it. This has been the most exciting, engaging kind of a discussion. And I especially want to do a shout out to Lori, because I know that we have kind of, really put a challenge into some respect in HTA. And I know you don't feel like you own HTA, nor do you have to apologize for all of HTA, nor are we saying that we want to kick out HTA or CADIS in any way whatsoever. But I really feel, and I said this here, there are so many of you. Glenn, I mean, I am just blown away by Glenn Monteith in your comments there. Because what you brought in is all those experiences now, from all the way circle around. I mean, I'm just really impressed. We've got Suzanne McGurn now over at CADIS. She's brought in, her experiences from being a healthcare provider, now gone into government bureaucracy, and then coming into CADIS and being able to bring that perspective, and has called me out a couple of times of really, if you want to participate, you've got to do it in a way that people can hear you, and that you demonstrate you're respecting others as well as wanting to be respected. We're not trying to bust down doors or run over anybody. I think because it's not going to get us anywhere. So, I think this is wise. I think, no, Bill, you're just a babe. Many of us that are the old folks here and they're looking at each other saying, yeah, how did we actually stay in this so long? We're hunting it to be the ones that better pick up this ball and continue to run with it. Because, Peter, I think, you're probably not quite as old as I am, but, I count you of the same vintage because we've gone through some wars together. It really is, an exciting opportunity, though, for us to do this. And I cannot do justice to the kind of discussion that took place in this panel. I hope everybody did feel that they were able to speak openly and that they were able to put the ideas on the table. I cannot thank enough this panel for being as open and honest, as engaging as they are. I did not feel people were saying things just because they needed to have the right words out there and the right messages, and people were trying to be, politically correct in it. I thought that was hugely important. I am really grateful to Jessica for coming in and speaking, and I've heard the private sector in more private meetings really give us some really solid kinds of of support here. And I really thank you for bringing this here to this table, because when we talk about needing to have this public-private partnership, it definitely means the private insurers as well. So I agree that, it was good to not see pharmacare be the top of the discussion again, because that's a distraction. Where we're going to go in terms of how we're going to pay for this may work out down the road somewhere. I also really want to thank Chris McMaster for coming back in and helping to bridge that notion of what are we doing in the research space, what does open research look like, and what can it look like in working with the private sector. I think we're all building this gigantic, I won't even say it's a bridge, because it's a gigantic platform that we can stand on. So maybe Canada, being what Canada is, this now becomes the opportunity where we can take advantage of that, where everybody wants to cooperate, everybody wants to work together, everybody can see the benefit of what the others bring to the table, and kind of what is good for me is going to hopefully be good for you, or if it isn't so far, we better make it work that way, because that's the only way it's going to work. So I feel like we've gone away from now winners and losers. So there isn't going to be, oh my gosh, if I fund rare diseases, I can't fund diabetes. It's not going to be that case, and it can't be. So I am truly excited to be here. I will say one of the things that's really true around rare diseases is I know that rare disease groups compete against each other. Nobody says, oh my God, if we're going to fund cystic fibrosis, am I going to kick, SMA or a new rare disease out the door? If I fund a new rare disease, are you taking away my funding? It isn't that. So I'm really pleased that where we are. I don't want to end up too much in just a platitude, but I'm hoping that we can continue this discussion. I will say that we're going to have some painful discussions coming forward. I already see it now. And I hope we're ready to go in there and to roll up our sleeves and to do that really honestly. I don't think we're going to agree on everything, but I think at the end of the day, we do have to agree. Otherwise, the system can't work.
Well, that's a great call to action, Durhan, and thank you all of the panelists and all the delegates, and Maureen put a shout out there to all the parents and patients on the line who are learning and contributing. I love your idea for the menu of things for the money that's going to flow next year, Maureen, which is training patients, and that was a call out to CORD as a as a school for patient leaders. So there are solutions out there that I don't think we've totally gone down the entire list of everything we need to do for April 1st on that 500 million. Those are going to be some difficult discussions going forward. So yeah, thank you to this panel and everyone who's on the line. Durhan, we wanted to mention another session that you're on tomorrow, because if the 100 people who have participated today and yesterday really like this conversation, and I think many people do, the Public Policy Forum has been leading an economic prosperity initiative, an economic prosperity summit, where they are going to be hosting a forum tomorrow on rare diseases as an opportunity to build the next economy. Where does Canada have to go? And I know a lot of people on the line, if you've ever been down to Boston and to Kendall Square in Cambridge, Massachusetts, you'll see that grew out of some public policy decisions decades ago around rare diseases. And around there, rare is not just a cost to be reckoned with; it's an investment to be made that will pay huge dividends. And you kicked off today, Durhan, noting that. So tomorrow, we've got Jason Field from Life Sciences Ontario. You're going to kick it off to give an update on what happened here from an economic prosperity perspective. And we're going to see what's happening in the provinces. And we've also got Health Canada, the Office of Strategic Pharmaceutical Management Strategy. So Andrew actually has been a delegate today and participating, who's going to give us an update on what's happening at Health Canada as well, and participate in that discussion. So just a plug. I'll put the information in the chat group for those who want to join tomorrow and keep the conversation going. Durhan, do you want to help close this out, given everything that's happened in the next 5 minutes? Over to you.
There is no closure. This is opening up the door to the next steps, and I think that's so important, right? Honestly, guys, buckle up. We're in for a hell of a 3-4 months. How many months? It's only 3 months, for gosh sakes, And I'm saying buckle up to my staff, because as you know, we have a tiny, mean, lean staff that works their butts off to get these things together. I say buckle up to Bill, because if you thought you were busy before and you had any other clients, well, we're hoping that we can have you keep your clients, but they will loan you to us. Because as you know, we have Bill on retainer, and that's an open issue, but Bill's retainer is such a peanuts that, his poor children, I think, would never be able to, not only get into any of their sporting events, I think they would be eating macaroni and cheese or beans forever if it were based on what we're doing. So we beg you, my plug to you is hire Bill, but give them to us. My beg to you is to make sure that you're attuned for us in terms of these next sessions, because we really do want to make sure that we're able to move this forward. And we thank so much, Caddis, we thank so much you know, all of the institutes that have been part of it. We also thank Health Canada. We know that, you know, their role has been to really be listening and to observing and to helping us move this forward. And we know that what we're going to say is not necessarily finished. I have one last thing I want to say. We're going to put this out. We're going to ask CORD, ask the representative of the patient community, ask the voice of those for whom this rare drug strategy is meant to primarily benefit. We're going to put out a contest. And the contest is going to be name the rare disease drug program. We got to quit calling it whatever it is we call it and make up all kinds of things around it. We need a name, you know, and the name has got to be able to reflect whatever. So there will be a call out. We will ask people to name it. There will be prizes. I guarantee you there will be amazing prizes that will not come out of the $1 billion. There will be amazing prizes that will be there. Not only just bragging rights, we want to name it. We have not been given permission to name it. Nobody at Health Canada or the government Canada says, hey, you guys go out and name it, but we feel we have the right to. I mean, who else should actually name this but the people that are actually going to make it up? So we would like to have a contest, put out a name, and it will be up to the government to reject it. So, you know, I put that out there strongly. So that's my approach in life, right? So, you know, and of course, was the despair of my parents, as you can imagine. I was disowned many times before I got to legal age here. But really, I'm saying quite strongly, you know, we're going to put this out, and there will be a bonus given. Not only will you give a name, you have to kind of explain to us why you think that name is the right name, okay? It doesn't have to be flowery, it doesn't have to be long. In fact, we expect it to be short. Send it to as many people as you want, and there's no limit in terms of how many you can put in. There's no restriction on who can actually submit it. You can be industry, you can be a researcher, you can be a clinician, you can be a patient, you can even be part of the policymakers. You can put it in under a pseudonym if you don't want to really be known as it. We would love to get everybody's suggestion. I haven't figured out how we're going to adjudicate it yet, but that'll happen.
We can have fun with that, Durhan. We can pick like a Dragon's Den panel or something like that. Pick the top 3 and say, okay, why do you think that? We can have a fun session.
We can do that. I was in the Dragon's Den recently. It was the best thing I ever did. Yeah. That would be great. We will do that. Okay. So you can not only put in the name, but you can also nominate yourself if you'd like to be part of the judging panel.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks. We'll see all of you soon. Happy holidays for those celebrating. And I hope everyone gets a restful, safe break and be well. Durhan, travel safely back to Canada. We expect to see you here soon and bring back all those great learnings from Ghana and Africa and everywhere else you go. And David, thank you for kicking off this panel. You know, it was great. And Maureen, for those I can still see, Glenn, Maureen, trust me, I am not getting too old for this. You know what? I'm here. We're going to finish the job. Okay. And we'll see you soon. Take care.